Chapter 457. The meaning of washing one's hands and making soup is very simple. The bride enters the kitchen for 3 days. Washing one's hands and making soup. A change in one's role in life. The first time holding hands, kissing, making love, killing. 13th Wong's first time. P.S. There were too many mistakes and missing words in yesterday's chapter. I plead guilty and will change. Also, today's monthly votes rankings are gloomy and murderous. It is truly like the mountains are angry, and the sunset is like blood. Beside me is Deng Shichong. Ahem, it's canvassing votes. Use all your strength to canvass monthly votes. The second day was the day before the third. This was not nonsense, because Warner was returning to the capital on the third day. Fan Xian was used to keeping his wife and family far away from all filthy matters, so he set the time for the second day. The wind was gentle and the sun was bright. The accumulated snow gradually melted. Tiana Street was drenched. The flowing stone pools by the side of the street, which had accumulated snow, finally began to flow. Carrying the snow and dried leaves, it moved toward the low-lying areas. The 4 city gates in and out of Jingdo were guarded by the 13 city gate guards. These 13 city gate guards were directly transferred from the palace. Not to mention the fact that the Jingdo garrison could not extend their hands in. Even the military elders of the Bureau of Military Affairs would not do much on the surface. Every night, the Jingdo city gates would be closed. In the history of the Qing kingdom, other than a few bloody coups, as well as a few reports of natural disasters and turmoil on the borders, there had never been a precedent of opening the gates at night. The old director of the Overwatch Council, Chun Pingping, was an exception. He lived in the Chun Garden outside the capital. The emperor had given this director special permission to enter the capital at night. However, there was only one exception. Other than Chun Pingping, no one could enter and leave Jingdo at night without imperial orders. After Fan Xian took control of the Overwatch Council, this exception had one more person. Thus, even though the Jingdo garrison Yuantai camp found Yin Shindu's body and reported it step by step until it finally reached the general who knew Yin Shindu's true identity, the general in the camp, in his shock and fear, still had no way of informing the people in Jingdo. The commander of the Jingdo garrison, Qin Heng, only learned of this news the next morning. Then, the northern governor, Yin Xiaoi, who had returned to the capital to debrief, also learned of this news. His own son had been assassinated in the camp last night. Yin Xiaoi sat on the side of the bed with his legs wide open. This was a habit he had developed from many years of riding a horse in the army. His eyes were somewhat indifferent as he looked at the messenger kneeling in front of the door. He tilted his head slightly, not daring to believe his ears. "Master!" The 2 concubines on the bed suppressed the fear and uneasiness in their hearts and struggled to get up. They helped Governor Yin put on his clothes and got some water to wash up. Throughout all of this, Yin Xiaoi maintained a kind of indifferent calmness. His hands that were rubbing in the hot water did not tremble in the slightest. Ever since he was a child, he had been exceptionally energetic. After enlisting in the army, he could not sleep without a woman. He had countless concubines at home. Even though he did not have a proper wife in his manor in the capital, he still had 5 concubines to serve him. Last night, under the wind and rain, these 2 concubines could not bear it any longer. Yin Xiaoi tilted his head and glanced at the concubines beside him. In the past, he was used to secretly being proud of his physical strength and energy, but today there was something strange in his heart. He felt a trace of loathing for these coquettish women. He had many women, but only one son. Calmly, he stood up, tied a black gold and jade belt around his waist, put on a snow-blocking cloak, and walked out the door. Outside the door, there were already soldiers and terrified generals of the Jingdo garrison waiting. Looking at the longbow and quiver of arrows held by his trusted aide, Yin Xiaoi was a little absent-minded beside his horse. Even so, from the moment he heard the news until now, his expression was still calm. There was not a hint of abnormality on his slightly dark face that carried a determined expression. The sound of horse hooves gradually left the Yin manor. Inside the manor, Two beautiful concubines had died tragically on the bed. Fresh blood dyed the entire green curtain. Under the protection of the soldiers, Governor Yin left the city gates and came to the Yuantai tent not far away. His expression was indifferent. He did not even glance at the commander of the camp, who had come to comfort him. He even ignored Qin Heng, who had hurried over. He went directly into the central military tent. Yin Shindu's body was placed in the tent. No one dared to touch the body because everyone was waiting for Governor Yin to personally come and take a look. Yin Xiaoyi stood in front of his son's body and didn't speak for a long time. He only furrowed his brows slightly. After a long time, his gaze lowered slightly, and he stretched out his hand to pry open his son's already stiff hand. The dead person's grip was very tight. Yin Xiaoyi pulled very hard and forcefully broke two of his son's fingers. He took something out of his son's palm and then raised it to his eyes to look at it closely. The light from outside the tent seeped in and gently snapped off the jade pendant. It shot into Yin Xiaoyi's eyes and made his pupils constrict slightly. He recognized this jade pendant. There was a small sword on the jade pendant and a few words carved on the other side. Particularly that day, in front of the Bureau of Military Affairs, Fan Xian had waved the horsewhip at him. It made this hidden resistance become a conflict that was about to explode. Thus, everyone would immediately think of Yin Shindu's death to Fan Xian. It wasn't Fan Xian, Yin Xiaoyi said coldly, but it must have something to do with Fan Xian. The city gates were right in front of them. The personal attendant with the arrow glanced worriedly at the governor, thinking if it truly had something to do with Sir Fan Jr., what would the governor do? Would he kill the emperor's illegitimate child with one arrow in Jingdo? Yin Xiaoyi narrowed his eyes slightly and didn't say anything. He only coughed and then covered his mouth. A trickle of blood seeped out from between his fingers. Last night's assassination did not spread. Not many people knew that Yin Xiaoyi's son was in the Jingdo garrison. Secondly, the time was too short. Even the Overwatch Council headquarters did not know the relevant details. The civil and military officials of the Qin court belonged to two different systems. Naturally, not many officials in court knew about this matter. It was a minor court conference. The officials at the palace gates were gathered in twos and threes, each with their own mountain. However, the relationship between the crown prince of the Eastern Palace and the second prince had eased a great deal, so the two factions of civil officials did not stand too far apart. The Minister of Revenue, Fan Jian, was saying something in a low voice to the two scholars of the Hall of Governmental Affairs. No one came close to the three of them. With the crack of a whip, the palace gates slowly opened. The commander of the Imperial Army, the Great Prince, walked out with a calm expression and bowed to the leaders at the front. Everyone quickly returned the bow. Ever since His Majesty had put the eldest prince in charge of the palace's security more than a year ago, the defense of the entire palace was indeed impregnable. The eldest prince was also a diligent person. Every time there was a court meeting, he would personally be on duty. He did not make any mistakes despite his status as a member of the royal family. Because of this, the officials who came to court all felt a glimmer of respect and fear toward the great prince. The officials filed in and went to court to discuss the gossip of the world with the Qing emperor. The palace gates immediately quieted down again. The snow on the square in front of the palace had long been swept clean, revealing the wet stones below. The snow that had been swept away formed a pile of snow about half a person's height on the other side of the square, like a low city. A carriage came from behind the long pile of snow. The carriage, the horse, and the driver were all black. The imperial soldiers guarding the palace gates and the guards inside immediately knew the identity of the person in the carriage. They couldn't help feeling curious and excited. The great prince pressed his hand on his sword and personally went forward to welcome them. He helped the young official, who still had difficulty moving, down from the carriage. The two of them spoke quietly all the way into the palace. The soldiers inside and outside the palace gates did not dare to breathe too loudly. They only carefully watched this scene from the corner of their eyes. It was not until the figures of the great prince and the young official disappeared into the royal palace that everyone let out a breath and excitedly began to discuss in low voices. "Did you see that?" Everyone says the great prince has a good relationship with him. It looks like it is not false. What's so strange about that? They are brothers. Brothers? Someone laughed coldly. Don't you remember how Commissioner Fan dealt with the second prince a year ago? Silence. Although the people of the Qing kingdom were open-minded, and there were rarely cases of people being punished for their words, they were talking about the royal family without restraint in front of the Palace of Brilliance. It had to be said that these soldiers, who had once followed the great prince to the west to fight the barbarians and later returned to the imperial army to stand guard, were indeed very daring. The two eunuchs looked at these imperial soldiers like they were looking at immortals. Is it the legendary Sir Fan Jr.? A guard, who had clearly not been in the palace for long, said with an excited expression, "It is indeed as the legends say. He is as handsome as a god. However, his complexion does not seem to be very good." Nonsense. He was assassinated a few days ago and suffered such heavy injuries. How could he have recovered? Speaking of which, it's strange. Sir Fan Jr.'s injuries healed very quickly. He can actually get off the ground and walk now. Why is he in such a rush to come to court? Don't forget, Sir Fan Jr. is the youngest 9th-level ace in the Qing kingdom. But, speaking of assassination, everyone immediately fell silent. They knew that this matter was too terrifying. It was best to talk less about it. Fan Xian and the great prince walked through the palace. They didn't know what the people behind them were talking about. However, the great prince couldn't help but be curious. Why was he in such a rush to enter the palace when his injuries had not healed? Why are you in such a rush to enter the palace? Recently, the palace has been a bit chaotic. In order to investigate the matter of you being assassinated, everyone is nervous. Fan Xian smiled and said, "Forgot? I remember that I sent the invitation to the manor. It should have been personally received by the great princess. Tonight, I'll treat at Baiwa Brothel. I have the strength to treat, but I don't hurry into the palace to report. I'm afraid the emperor will spank me. You should call her great imperial concubine or sister-in-law." Why are you still calling her great princess? Forget it. The great imperial concubine sounds awkward. It always reminds me of Yiling. Sister-in-law is even less appropriate. I don't want to be scolded in front of my face by an official of Taichung Temple. My surname is Fan, but yours is Li. Fan Xian's words were a bit wild. At least, as an official speaking to the great prince, it appeared a bit unruly. The great prince knew what he was thinking and smiled helplessly. Suddenly, he said solemnly, "Do you know about that matter?" "What matter?" Fan Xian furrowed his brows slightly. "Yin Xiaoi's son was assassinated last night." The great prince stared into Fan Xian's eyes, as if trying to determine from them whether or not this assassination had anything to do with him. Fan Xian raised his brows and couldn't be bothered to pretend to be surprised. "If he's dead, then he's dead. In any case, he's not one of my people. Stop guessing. This matter has nothing to do with me." The great prince looked at him and shook his head. "Regardless of whether or not it has anything to do with you, this matter will probably be remembered on your head." "So be it." Fan Xian smiled warmly. "I have many enemies in this life. I don't care if there's one or two more. That person is Yin Xiaoi." The great prince reminded him in a serious tone. Fan Xian didn't reply. He only thought to himself that the great prince beside him indeed had some power in the military. At this moment, the city gates had probably just opened, yet he already knew the story of what had happened in Yuantai camp. The great prince saw that he was ignoring him and furrowed his brows. "I'm afraid this matter will not be resolved so easily. Think about it. An assassin managed to sneak into the camp of the garrison near Jingdou. Once the matter is exposed, no one can think about having good days. This matter was done too impudently." Fan Xian heard the hidden meaning in his words and couldn't resist smiling coldly. "Yuantai camp? A few days ago, someone dared to move the military's city-guarding crossbows to kill an imperial envoy in the valley. Just who was more impudent?" The great prince saw that he was angry and knew that he had lost a number of subordinates in the attack in the valley. He could only change the topic and ask, "When is Chun girl coming back? Grandmother and my mother have missed her for who knows how long. I'm afraid they won't be willing to let her go to Jiangnan next year." Fan Xian said, "She'll be back tomorrow." Oh, right, I've also brought back the princess of the Hu tribe. Additionally, I bought a house in Yansong Alley. The place is remote and quiet. It's perfect to hide a mistress. The great prince heard these words and hesitantly asked, "What mistress?" Fan Xian took out a deed to the house and threw it to him. The corners of his mouth twitched slightly. "I'll give you a mistress." The great prince didn't know what to say. He glared at him angrily and said, "In front of others, you have the graceful and elegant face of an immortal poet. Who knew that you have a sharp and unkind mouth of a fox?" "That is true," Fan Xian said proudly. Fan Xian proudly said, "I already have enough of a reputation. Next, I'm going to tear off all pretenses and have a good time with everyone." The great prince was slightly shocked. He furrowed his brows and said, "You invited so many people tonight. What exactly do you want to do? Don't mess around." "How could I? They are all descendants of nobility. I can't wait to curry favor with them." Fan Xian smiled coldly and said, "However, I know what you're thinking. If you don't want your brothers to fight, it's simple. Quickly defeat them." The great prince disagreed and said, "These words are hard to hear. We are all of the same father. Just quietly wait for the divine judgment. You should know your limits." "Don't mind." Fan Xian shook his head. "It's still that old saying. My surname is Fan, but don't worry, I don't have a hobby of chopping off my own fingers. As long as they are willing to behave after tonight, I won't do anything." The great prince smiled. Fan Xian thought for a moment and then couldn't resist laughing self-mockingly. Speaking of which, from ancient times until now, it could be seen in the history books that very few young officials dared to threaten the crown prince and princes like he did. Furthermore, he had used such a lecturing tone. This matter appeared somewhat absurd. Fan Xian insisted that his surname was Fan. He knew that if it wasn't for the fact that his surname should have been Li, he would not have the power to negotiate with the members of the royal family. He wouldn't even have the right to do so. Based on his style of doing things, he would probably have died a long time ago. Thus, when he waited for a long time in the royal study and finally saw the emperor, surnamed Li, lift the curtains and enter, his behavior could be considered respectful. However, a glimmer of coldness and stubbornness occasionally appeared between his brows. As the saying goes, acting along the way was the same from beginning to end. To be continued. If you want to know what happens next, please log on to www.chidian.com. More chapters. Support the author. Support original reading. Chapter 458. The inside of the royal study was much warmer than the outside. Silver bamboo charcoal from Langyizu burned in 3 fire basins. The intricately designed fire basins did not overflow with ash, only overflowing warmth. It enveloped the entire room in an atmosphere of spring that did not match the season. There was only a faint burning smell. The smell was not unpleasant, but Fan Xian's sensitive nose was not used to it. He couldn't help but miss the warm smell of a white room in a distant world. He thought of 2 witty sayings he had once read in his previous life. The emperor has never used a cell phone, and the emperor has never had air conditioning. The emperor minded his own business and sat down on the couch. From his expression, it could be seen that he was very satisfied with the warmth of the royal study. The silver hair at his temples and the slight wrinkles at the corners of his eyes had all smoothed out. On the couch, he took off the dragon robe he was wearing. A young eunuch had long since brought him cotton clothes and brought over a bowl of warm bird's nest. Fan Xian stood quietly to the side, but his gaze couldn't resist sneaking a curious glance. There was indeed nothing strange about the daily life of a supreme being. The emperor was drinking when he saw Fan Xian's sneaky appearance out of the corner of his eye. He couldn't resist laughing and scolded. "Is there nothing good to eat in Jiangnan? You're so greedy." Fan Xian chuckled and said, "The main thing is that I had to enter the palace early today, so I just randomly grabbed a few bites for breakfast." The emperor waved his hand and indicated for him to sit down. Eunuch Yao had been waiting for this edict at the side. He quickly went behind the curtain to bring out a round, embroidered stool. Fan Xian sat down and couldn't help but think of a year and a half ago when he first entered the royal study to discuss matters. He was also curious as to why the emperor had not continued the meeting in the royal study after the court conference had ended. Instead, he had summoned him alone. Having not seen the emperor for over a year and thinking about such things as acting, Fan Xian didn't know what to say for a moment. Fortunately, when monarchs and officials met, it was the emperor who should speak first. The royal study immediately sank into silence again. The emperor placed the half-drunk bird's nest on the table and raised his head to look at Fan Xian's face. Looking at that delicate and warm face, for some reason, his heart, which had been cold for 20 years, moved. He couldn't resist slowly shaking his head, wanting to remove that glimmer of emotion from the emperor's head. "How are your injuries?" the emperor asked as indifferently as possible. Fan Xian bowed slightly and replied respectfully, "Thank you for your concern, Your Majesty. I am fine." He knew that the emperor already knew of the news of Yin Xiaoyi's son's unnatural death, but since the emperor did not mention it and did not connect this matter to him, he was happy to pretend to be mute and was too lazy to make any more excuses. "Your Majesty?" The emperor repeated this in his heart, sighed, and smiled. "There is no need to be so reserved. If there is anything you want to say, say it. Before the new year, I banished you to Jiangnan because Zhen wanted to sharpen you and promote you, but it was too hard on you." It was not easy for the emperor to say such gentle words. Fan Xian's heart moved slightly, but he did not soften. Evenly, he said, "To be honest, Your Majesty, this trip to Jiangnan, I am very willing." He continued with a smile, "The scenery in Jiangnan is beautiful. I've always wanted to go there." He didn't refer to himself as a subject, but as I. Every time the conversation between the two of them developed in such a way. First, it went from ruler and subject, then to old and young, and finally to father and son. They never said it out loud, but both of them were well aware of it. It was warm, sour, and shameless. The emperor smiled. A moment later, he quietly said, "You have done very well in Jiangnan. I am very gratified." Naturally, he was talking about the matter of the palace treasury, the Jiaozhou matter, and the Jiangnan road matter. Fan Xian had demonstrated the demeanor and boldness that a young official should have in all of these matters. For this court, for this emperor, he had reaped many benefits from the people and the military. Presently, Fan Xian was a knife in the emperor's hand. He had basically offended all of the powerful classes in court. The emperor also understood this. Thinking of the attack in the valley, he couldn't help but feel a faint sense of pity for Fan Xian. Only not much. After talking briefly about the matters in Jiangnan, the report on political affairs came to an end. After all, the main purpose of returning to court to report on his work was still in court. In a few days, Fan Xian would wear official robes and go to court with a special edict to receive the praise or criticism of all the civil and military officials in the court. Today, in the royal study, it was nothing more than a heart-to-heart talk between an emperor and a close official. Particularly regarding the Jiangnan and Jiaozhou matters, they had long been passed on to the emperor through endless secret memorials. The discussion today was elsewhere. The other place was Danzhou. The emperor seemed to be particularly interested in Fan Xian's trip to Danzhou to visit his relatives and asked in detail. Although Fan Xian felt it was strange, he patiently explained everything. He didn't even leave out the matter of Donger, who knew how many spies the emperor had by his side. The emperor also asked about how the wet nurse in Danzhou was doing. Fan Xian answered each of them and described the present scene of Danzhou, the white seagulls, and the precipitous cliff beside the city. Then, Fan Xian fell silent because he discovered with some surprise that the emperor seemed to be lost in thought. The emperor's eyelids were slightly lowered. The wrinkles at the corners of his eyes showed the unique charm of a middle-aged man. He didn't look at Fan Xian and didn't speak. He only calmly followed Fan Xian's narration as he recalled everything in Danzhou. Suddenly, he realized that the storytelling voice had stopped. The emperor raised his head in a daze and found Fan Xian was looking at him with concern. He couldn't help but smile and say, "It's nothing. I was just thinking that after returning from the last Western expedition, I haven't left Jingdou again. I can't help but miss the scenery of Danzhou." During the last Western expedition, there had been changes in Jingdo. Taiping courtyard had been massacred. Fan Xian was carried by Wu Zhu and sat in the carriage with the black cloth to Danzhou. Fan Xian's expression did not change. He only hesitantly asked, "Your Majesty, have you also been to Danzhou?" "Of course I have." The corners of the emperor's lips twitched slightly, and he smiled slightly. "When I went to Danzhou, you hadn't been born yet. It was there that I met your mother." Ruler and official were both silent at the same time. They both felt that these words were a bit idiotic. The father had just met the mother. Of course, the son hadn't been born yet. A moment later, Fan Xian said with a glimmer of confusion, "So, it was in Danzhou. Didn't Director Chun and Minister Fan tell you?" The emperor said with a not quite there smile, "I thought you would know something about what happened back then." Fan Xian knew that if he opened his mouth and asked, the emperor in front of him, who was already immersed in beautiful memories, would certainly satisfy his curiosity. For some reason, Fan Xian didn't want to ask. It was like what kind of beautiful scenery was hidden behind that layer of gauze, and in the mountains there were monsters, big monsters. He only smiled calmly and said, "The elders didn't have the time to talk to me about these things. However, when I was young, I knew that the court had a special edict for Danzhou. In the beginning, it was to exempt taxes for 3 years. This time, when I returned, I found that it has always been exempt. The people of Danzhou live well and are endlessly grateful to your Majesty. I am the ruler of the world. It is right for me to love my people. What need is there for gratitude?" The emperor smiled and looked at Fan Xian. He sighed and said, "Exempting Danzhou from taxes for 20 years is, first, because of my mother. Second, it is to thank the harbor back then." Fan Xian found it difficult to respond to these words. Did he have to accompany the emperor in talking about his first love? Furthermore, that first love was his own mother. Coincidentally, his stomach growled. His eyes turned, and he said, "Your Majesty, I'm truly hungry. Grant me a bowl of bird's nest." The emperor immediately laughed loudly. Pointing at Fan Xian's nose, he couldn't say anything for a moment. Ever since the Qing emperor had ascended to the throne, he had established himself in a region. His eyes looked down on the world. There is no one in the court who did not feel fear and respect for life. For over a dozen years, no official had dared to complain about being hungry and begging for food when the ruler and official were talking. Even when the crown prince and great prince were young and carried by the ladies in the palace, they did not dare to speak so rudely. After a long time, the emperor finally stopped laughing. His eyes were full of tender love. He scolded, "This shamelessness is nothing like your mother, ahem." The emperor forcefully swallowed his words. Out of the corner of his eyes, he glanced at the half-bowl of bird's nest on the table. Casually pointing, he said, "It's still warm. Eat it quickly." Fan Xian was startled. He eagerly stepped forward to receive the sparkling white porcelain bowl. Without any reservations, he finished eating in a few mouthfuls. His face did not purposely reveal tears of gratitude or an expression of His Majesty's boundless grace, but he still ate very smoothly. This scene fell into the emperor's eyes. The emperor was very satisfied. He thought to himself that Ji was indeed not a fake person. However, the emperor did not know that Fan Xian was cursing in his heart. He was not cursing the emperor for being petty. Rather, he hated that the bird's nest porridge had been eaten by Ji. Eunuch Yao, who was standing quietly to the side, was shocked when he saw this scene. He had been in the palace for many years, but he had not seen such a harmonious situation between ruler and official many times. The last time seemed to have been when Shu the scholar had returned from northern Qi. In order to show his favor and not take it to heart, the emperor had granted him half a piece of dried meat. Last time, Shu the scholar had been moved beyond words because of that piece of dried meat. He had knelt in front of the emperor in tears and repeatedly praised the emperor. He had not been as free and natural as Sir Fan Jr. was now. The emperor seemed to like Sir Fan Jr.'s way of doing things more. Eunuch Yao lowered his head, but he was sighing in admiration in his heart. This kind of ruler and official, this kind of father and son, was rarely seen in the palace. Just as he was thinking this, he was roused by the emperor's words. He quickly took the bowl of porridge and retreated. He walked along the eaves of the palace, but he still thought of the scene earlier with deep fear and admiration. There was only the emperor and Fan Xian left in the royal study. A moment later, the emperor suddenly opened his mouth and said, "You are now a person of status. You can't mess around like you did in the Imperial College. Danzhou, to kick the son of an official's family until he can't get out of bed for half a year for the sake of a family servant girl is a loss of face." Hearing these words, Fan Xian straightened his neck. In a calm but stubborn tone, he said, "The emperor is right. However, if there's a next time, I will still kick him." "Fine, fine." The emperor smiled. "If you want to kick him, kick him. However, there has to be a limit to messing around. Don't go too far." Fan Xian sensed that there was another meaning in the emperor's words, so he didn't reply. He only nodded his head. The emperor looked at this young man's brows and furrowed his brows. He thought that this kid had made such a ruckus for the sake of a servant girl who had been chased out of the family. A dozen of his subordinates had been killed by crossbow bolts in the valley. Given this kid's vengeful nature, it would probably be difficult for him to forcefully swallow this anger. Of course, the emperor could directly ask Fan Xian to calm down, but the emperor did not want to do so. "I hear you're treating tonight?" Fan Xian started slightly and then respectfully said, "Yes, I've been away from the capital for over a year. There are a number of people I haven't seen. Let's use this opportunity to get together." The emperor's expression calmed. "It's still the same as before. Messing around can be done, but there is a limit." "Yes, Your Majesty. The court will investigate the matter in the valley and give you an explanation." "Yes, Your Majesty." "Young man, you have to look at things further. Don't just limit yourself to what is in front of you." "Yes, Your Majesty." "Find some time the next year. I want to go to Jiangnan and see how you and Xueqing have taken care of my granaries and palace treasury." "Yes." Fan Xian abruptly raised his head and looked at the emperor with a glimmer of surprise. The emperor was going on an inspection tour. This was something that had never happened in a dozen years, particularly with the various powers in Jingdou stirring. Although the emperor was in the palace, and no one dared to be too arrogant, the matter in the valley and Jiaozhou all showed that the volcano under the dragon chair had become active. At this time, the emperor dared to go on an inspection tour. Fan Xian didn't understand what the emperor was thinking. After a moment of silence, he said, "I think changing his title to an official meant that he wanted to formally admonish and dissuade the emperor. However, the emperor did not give him the opportunity. Waving his hand, he said, "I have already made up my mind. The world is in my hands. There is no need to care about a few bugs jumping around. I'm going to Danzhou to take a look. After the new year, you can return to Jiangnan. Remember to prepare well. However, the matter needs to be done secretly." Fan Xian had nothing to say and could only nod his head in agreement. The emperor looked at him and furrowed his brows. "You remember everything I said earlier?" Fan Xian guessed with a bit of a headache. "Are you referring to the messing around?" The emperor nodded his head with relief. "I only have these few sons. If you want to mess around, do as you please. Just don't make it beyond control. I also understand a bit about your thoughts." "Very good. Continue doing this." Fan Xian's heart jumped. "Son, this could already be considered a clear indication, but he felt that the emperor's gaze seemed to have penetrated his body and seen through his thoughts. The emperor knew what he was thinking. He immediately thought of the conflict he had with the second prince in front of Baiwa brothel the year before last, and the conversation he had with the second prince in the tea shop. If the emperor was relying on that conversation to guess Fan Xian's thoughts, it had to be said that his guess was basically correct. That Haitang lady has returned to northern Qi, right? The emperor suddenly said. Fan Xian's heart jumped again, but a glimmer of helplessness appeared on his face. Nodding his head, he said, "Lang Qiao brought people to bring her back." The emperor closed his eyes slightly and said, "At first, I didn't like it. After all, it hasn't even been 2 days since Chun promised herself to you. However, later on, I felt that this matter was not necessarily without any benefits. Tianyi Dao has deep connections with the various worship temples. If you have the ability to control Tianyi Dao in your hands, for the court, it is a great service comparable to military merit. Without waiting for Fan Xian to speak, the emperor continued lightly. After Ku He's death, it should be Haidang who succeeds. You have to think clearly about the connection. Fan Xian lowered his head and was silent. The emperor said, "There is no harm in being closer to the women of northern Xi, but it is best to maintain some distance from northern Xi. I don't doubt you. However, the Qing court's ambitions are for the world. Your various actions this year will always make some people in the military suspicious. They're all straightforward men on horseback. What they want is to open up new territory. When you return to the capital this time, presumably, you also felt that the attitude of the Bureau of Military Affairs toward you is not very good. This is one of the reasons." Fan Xian remained silent. He knew that this was the so-called conflict between the Dove faction and the Hawk faction. However, the emperor was certainly a carnivore in his bones. Although he didn't doubt him, these words were actually a serious reminder to him. "Yes, your majesty," Fan Xian replied warmly. "I know what I'm doing." Looking at his careful appearance, the emperor smiled comfortingly and waved his hand. "It's rare that you're back in the capital. Take a walk around the palace." He was silent for a moment and then said, "Make the Empress Dowager happy." Fan Xian accepted the edict and left the royal study. Eunuch Yao was waiting outside the door. Seeing him come out, he led him around the palace. Although Fan Xian had entered the palace many times and was familiar with the paths inside, he knew that it was against the rules for a foreign official like him to enter the palace to see the emperor and greet the ladies of each palace. He had to be particularly careful, so he needed a eunuch to lead the way. When all was said and done, it was his status as a non-official member of the royal family and the princess' son-in-law that gave him the opportunity to walk freely in the royal palace's gardens. The first place he went was Hongguang Palace, the Empress Dowager's ancestors' palace. The Empress Dowager had just woken up from her afternoon nap. Her body was a little tired, so she didn't say much to Fan Xian. However, Fan Xian sensitively sensed that although the Empress Dowager's attitude toward him was still cold, it was much better than when they were eating mutton giblet soup. After chatting for a bit, Fan Xian saw that the old woman's expression was a little uncomfortable, so he tactfully took his leave. Before he left, he said that he would wait for Wanner to return before going into the palace to greet her. As expected, the old woman was happy. Before leaving the palace, Fan Xian said a few words to the female official in a quiet voice and wrote out a prescription for the old woman's body. Although the female official in Hongguang Palace didn't dare give the Empress Dowager medicine indiscriminately, she knew of the medical reputation of this popular figure in court. She happily accepted the prescription and waited for the Imperial Academy of Medicine to examine it before using it. She couldn't resist praising the prince consort for his filial piety. Fan Xian smiled and didn't say anything. He left Hongguang Palace and followed the wide royal palace paths west. When he passed Guangxin Palace, he couldn't resist taking a few more glances. To the side, Eunuch Yao carefully asked, "Sir Fan, it's Guangxin Palace." Fan Xian was startled and jokingly scolded, "Of course I know. What are you thinking, you old man?" Eunuch Yao chuckled. "No matter what, she is your mother-in-law. If we don't go see her and it gets to the Empress Dowager's ears, I'm afraid she won't be happy." Fan Xian was startled. He stopped not far from Guangxin Palace. To be continued. If you want to know what happens next, please log on to www.qijian.com. More chapters. Support the author. Support original reading. Chapter 459. Fan Xian stared at Guangxin Palace in a daze. He looked at the pillar at the foot of the palace and wondered if the hole in the pillar had been filled with lime or not. The first time he had spied into the royal palace at night, he had been stabbed by that serving girl through the pillar. The tip of the sword pierced through the thick wooden pillar and almost pierced his waist. To this day, Fan Xian seemed to still be able to feel the murderous intent on the sword, even though the serving girl had been killed on the spot. It was also that night that he had overheard the eldest princess colluding with the northern Qi royal family, the truth of Yin Bingyun being betrayed, and blocked Yin Shaoi's arrow that seemed to have come from the horizon. The snow had stopped, but a cold wind blew through the royal palace. It was even colder than a few days ago. Fan Xian shivered and shook his head self-mockingly. He left with eunuch Yao and headed toward the eastern palace where the empress and crown prince were. Although the eldest princess was his mother-in-law and would eventually have to see her, it was best to maintain some distance from that seductive, cold, and emotionless woman. Every day he could delay, seeing her was a day. These years, under the emperor's secret arrangements and the cooperation of Chun Pingping and various other parties, Fan Xian had gradually accepted all of the eldest princess's power. The two sides had long been unable to coexist. There would eventually come a day when they would fight. However, the princess's power was not as it had been in the past, but Fan Xian was still wary. It was not only because she was Wanner's mother, but also because of the strange feeling in his heart. In his previous life, he had heard a song by Lady He about giving him something and something. Fan Xian also felt this way. The eldest princess had given him the palace treasury, her daughter, her lover, and the Chui family. The Ming family was also about to be given to him. It looked like there were still many things she wanted to pass on to him. If he was the eldest princess, he would probably also bite his lip and not speak. His eyes would spit fire and burn this bad son-in-law to death. Thank you to a certain book friend. I forgot your ID. Sorry. There was also the Junshan conference and the restless people in the military. Although the eldest princess was not a dinosaur that could spit fire, on the contrary, she was rather alluring. Fan Xian was still a bit afraid of the madness and charm of her gentleness. It felt very awkward to stay with such a 30-something mother-in-law who was known as the most beautiful woman in the world. Thus, from beginning to end, Fan Xian had only seen his greatest enemy once. This matter in itself was very interesting. Eunuch Yao glanced at the silent Fan Xian and didn't say anything. He followed with small, quick steps. Not long after, they arrived at the Eastern Palace. Coincidentally, the Empress was in Guangxin Palace chatting with the eldest princess. Only the Crown Prince was reading under the guidance of the Grand Tutor. Seeing Fan Xian enter the palace, the Crown Prince welcomed him with a smile and said, "How are your injuries? Originally, I wanted to go to your residence to see you, but thinking that I might disturb your rest, I gave up on this idea." Fan Xian bowed in greeting, then straightened up and smiled. "My body has always been strong. I will be fine after resting for a few days. Today, I received an edict to enter the palace, so I came to see you, Crown Prince, so that you would not worry. When is little sister Chin coming back?" "Tomorrow." The Crown Prince smiled and said, "Since she's not here, you should seize the opportunity to play." The two of them smiled and sat down. They talked about the scenery and beauties of Jiangnan, but they didn't talk about anything unpleasant. Going back a few years, the Crown Prince had treated Fan Xian very well. Although he had listened to Xian Chuwu's suggestion and expressed goodwill toward Fan Xian with the intention of drawing him to his side, when Fan Xian had just entered the capital, the two of them had gotten along quite well. However, no one had thought that later matters would develop in such a strange manner. Fan Xian was actually also a prince. Furthermore, there was a problem left over from history that had not been resolved. Thus, naturally, Fan Xian picked it out and the Crown Prince became the person on the other side. Both sides knew that because of the problem left over from history, it was impossible for them to work together again. Inevitably, they both sighed in their hearts. However, during these 2 years, Fan Xian had primarily been on the second prince's side and had not carried out an all-out attack on the Crown Prince's faction. Thus, on the surface, the two of them could still maintain their current joyful and harmonious feeling. Even if the two of them had already shed all pretense of cordiality in the palace, they still had to be joyful and harmonious. Eunuch Yao watched this scene coldly from the side. In his heart, he admired the shrewdness of the members of the royal family. After a warm conversation ended, Fan Xian rose to bid farewell. Moving closer to the Crown Prince's ear, he said in a quiet voice, "Your Highness, come back tonight." The Crown Prince smiled and said, "Speaking of which, I've actually never been to that brothel of yours." This genuine Crown Prince, who had been gradually marginalized by the day, sighed and said, "As you know, these years, I've been cultivating my character and rarely go outside the palace to play. Let's talk about this famous Baoyue brothel. First it was the second brother, then it was you." They all had their ways. I don't have any. Fan Xian wasn't sure if there was any hidden meaning in these words, but he was too lazy to guess. He chuckled, bowed respectfully, and left the Eastern Palace. Outside the palace, he was not surprised to see a familiar person. The eunuch with a face full of acne was the current head of the eunuchs in the Eastern Palace, Hongzhu. Hongzhu quickly moved to the side to greet him. Fan Xian's expression was cold. He made a sound of acknowledgement and walked forward. However, there was a strange feeling in his heart. Looking at Hongzhu's expression, it seemed that he had something to say to him. There was some fear between this little eunuch's brows, but he didn't know what he was afraid of. However, in the palace, Fan Xian would not pay attention to Hongzhu. He still had to pretend to look down on him. This chess piece buried in the palace could not be used carelessly. Following this, he went to Lady Shu and Lady Ning's palaces to bring a book list for the second prince's birth mother, Lady Shu. They were all ancient books from the Jiangnan Tianyi Pavilion. Lady Shu was clearly surprised. She hadn't thought that Fan Xian, who was fighting to the death with her son, would still carefully wait on her. She was slightly moved. In Lady Ning's palace, Fan Xian was given a good scolding. This was the first time this outspoken woman, who was born in Dongyi, saw Fan Xian after learning of his past. Looking at Fan Xian's brows and expression, Lady Ning couldn't help but think of the young lady of the Yi family who had saved her and the child in her womb. She was angry that Fan Xian didn't take his life seriously and scolded him until he nodded repeatedly. After talking about some stories from the past, Lady Ning's gaze softened and warmed. She looked at Fan Xian like she was looking at her own son and gently rubbed his head. She told him to bring Princess Chun into the palace often to see her when he had free time. Fan Xian agreed to each of them. As he left the palace, he occasionally turned his head and found that Lady Ning seemed to be wiping away the moisture at the corners of her eyes. His heart couldn't help but become wet. He felt an indescribable sorrow. These were all people from the past and things from the past. Busying and walking, Fan Xian also began to feel annoyed. It was like entering the palace for the first time to greet the ladies before the wedding. Walking through each palace, the things they said and the things they did were all about the same. The continuous repetition was truly exhausting on both of their minds. Fortunately, Shufeng Palace, which he came to last, could be more relaxed. After chasing away Eunuch Yao, Fan Xian leaned against the chair like a tired dog. Narrowing his eyes, he sized up the serving girl busily, serving him tea. The serving girl's brows were clear and gentle. Her head was lowered the entire time. She was very well behaved. Fan Xian couldn't help but feel moved. As he accepted the tea, he pinched her white wrist. The serving girl glared at Fan Xian. Fan Xian laughed loudly and said, "Xing, the first time I saw you, you were only 13. Now that you've grown up, your temper has also grown." Reclining on the couch, Yi Pin watched Fan Xian and the child mess around. She couldn't resist opening her mouth and saying, "Go mess around outside. Don't come and mess with the people in my palace." Xing was the girl who had led Fan Xian around the palace to greet the ladies. Hearing the words of her two mistresses, her face immediately reddened, and she ran to the back with small steps. Fan Xian took a sip of tea to moisten his throat. Seriously, he said, "Aunt, I'm about to leave the palace, so I won't talk much with you." "Leave the palace?" Yi Pin was slightly startled and immediately understood what was going on. A glimmer of worry rose between her brows. "What exactly do you want to do tonight?" Fan Xian was also startled and asked, "You know about this?" Yi Pin covered her mouth and smiled. "Sir Fan Jr. is holding a banquet tonight and inviting those important figures. This matter has long spread. It is the most sensational news in the capital. Although I live in the palace, how could I not know?" Fan Xian forced a smile and said, "It's only been one day. How could there be such a big ruckus? It's just that I haven't been back to the capital for over a year, so it's hard not to invite him." Yi Pin said seriously, "Although there are some things I want to say to you, and at least thank you on behalf of the child for this year of discipline. I know your business at night is more important. You should go first." She paused and then said, "Have you invited Hongsheng?" Fan Xian shook his head and smiled slightly. "I'll take one to King Jing's manor some other day. Iguipin nodded. Fan Xian smiled again and said, I can't leave yet. I'll come specifically to pick up the third prince. At this time, Master Lu is still teaching him. How can I leave? Iguipin paused and said worriedly, Pinger is also going. Brothers, get together. With me here, what are you worried about? Fan Xian smiled warmly with unspeakable confidence. It was close to the end of the year, and the heavy snow suddenly stopped. No one knew when it would start again. Jingdo was cold, but red lanterns hung high in the buildings by the street. Red candles burned brightly, and warm light scattered everywhere. It was as if the valuable bamboo charcoal was free. 3 layers of thick leather curtains hung on the main door of Baiwa brothel. Occasionally, a servant would pass by and lift the curtains. Hot air would rush out from inside the building. For a moment, the air on this street seemed a bit warmer than other places. There were no pedestrians passing by on the street. The Jingdo government bailiffs and soldiers of the Jingdo garrison stationed there rubbed their frozen hands and looked at the shining building. They didn't say anything, but they were cursing in their hearts. They had to stand guard outside while the nobles in the building could bathe in the spring wind. Of all the restaurants and brothels in the world, probably only Baiwa brothel could be so extravagant. In the past, it would not have been like this. However, today was different. Baiwa brothel did not open for business today. Half of the street had been sealed off by the people of the Jingdo government and the Jingdo garrison. This was an order that Baiwa brothel had reported to the government ahead of time. Without any delay, it had been specially approved. The people of the Jingdo government did not have the right to attend this gathering, but he still had to put an effort to set up all the defenses. It was not only him. The other officials in Jingdo also thought the same. Regardless of which faction they belonged to, they all had to serve Baiwa brothel today. Everyone who could be called a master in Jingdo was coming to Baiwa brothel. The Imperial College's Sai, Taichung Temple's vice minister, head of the Palace Treasury Transport Department, Overwatch Council's commissioner, inspector of Jiangnan, Sir Fan Jr., was treating today. The dazzling, powerful, and official position that was almost longer than the family tree was treating. Who dare not come? Who dare not come? Although everyone knew that Sir Fan Jr. was a lone official who dared to offend court officials and was willing to offend court officials, the guests today were the Crown Prince, 3 princes, 2 deputies of the Bureau of Military Affairs, and a few powerful figures. If even these people had to give Fan Xian face, then there was no need to mention others. Today, Baiwa brothel was crowded with officials. If anyone had the ability to kill all the guests tonight, the Qin kingdom would probably fall into chaos. The Jingdo government and the Jingdo garrison would not be able to control their vigilance. Looking at the tightness of the defense, it was comparable to the layers upon layers of deep palaces. A few high-class sedans arrived in front of Baiwa brothel under the cover of dusk. A few more important figures arrived in carriages. Behind them, a few powerful figures in the military rode in. No one brought too many personal attendants to obstruct Fan Xian's eyes. The few sons and grandsons only brought 2 or 3 tiger guards. These officials were worried about their own safety. Although the attack in the valley had happened recently, everyone knew that Baiwa brothel was the Fan family's property. The Great Prince arrived. The left and right deputies of the Bureau of Military Affairs arrived. Xian Chiwu arrived. Rin Shaoan arrived. Baiwa brothel was in full operation today. The girls helped these important figures to a side room to rest while they waited for the banquet to begin. Fan Xian chatted idly with them for a bit and told some naughty jokes. He then led the child beside him to the door because he had heard the news of the Crown Prince's arrival. Seeing the child obediently allow Fan Xian to lead him, the hearts of the 2 deputies of the Bureau of Military Affairs and the other officials at the banquet shook. The scene in front of them was enough to make these important figures think of many things. In ancient times, there were those who held the emperor hostage to order the marquises. Now, there was Sir Fan Jr. holding the child's hand. Who knew if the future Qin kingdom and the future world would be these 2 people? Fan Xian was holding the 3rd prince's hand. The 3rd prince shivered and turned his head to gaze at his teacher, who was 2 heads taller than him. A glimmer of worship flashed through his eyes. Shortly after, he asked for guidance. "Sir, your injury has not healed yet. Why did you come out to welcome us?" Fan Xian shook his head and gently explained, "The person who has come is the crown prince, the heir to the country. His identity is different. Furthermore, he is your elder brother. Regardless of whether you are an official or a brother, you should show some respect." A small sedan arrived in front of Baoyue brothel under the protection of a dozen guards. Fan Xian's eyes were sharp. He saw a few tiger guards with long knives on their backs waiting coldly. Baoyue brothel was holding a banquet today. In order to prevent the people's discussions from flourishing and making the court feel awkward, all of the guests had removed their usual ceremonial guards. Even the crown prince, who had just arrived, could be considered to have a light carriage. Fortunately, this was the case. Otherwise, this street would probably be blocked to death by the pomp of these important figures. The curtain of the sedan lifted. The crown prince, dressed in light yellow clothing, came down from the sedan with a face full of smiles. Raising his eyes, he saw Fan Xian and the third prince welcoming him outside the building. The crown prince was in a good mood. Although this was due, given Fan Xian's present power, this kind of respect was exactly what the crown prince needed. Fan Xian and the third prince rushed to bow. The crown prince hurriedly helped him up. In a moment, everyone in the building knew the crown prince had arrived and quickly came out to welcome him. Only the great prince seemed to have been so happy from drinking that he forgot to come out. The crown prince knew that his brother came from the ranks and had always been like this, so he didn't pay it much attention. A group of people surrounded the front of the building and were just about to go into chat when another carriage slowly came over. The crown prince turned his head curiously and wondered who was putting on more airs than him to arrive later than him. Everyone also looked over and saw a thin, middle-aged official come down from the carriage. This official was not wearing clothing that indicated his rank, but everyone immediately recognized him. They couldn't help feeling surprised and shocked that this official would also come. The person who had come was none other than the governor of Jiangnan Road, Xueqing. Of the 7 roads under heaven, Xueqing controlled one. As a super-level official, he also controlled the wealthiest road in the world. Most importantly, he was the emperor's trusted aide and had once been the teacher of various princes in the library. Compared to the officials in court, his status was even more respected. Xueqing looked at everyone and smiled slightly. He first bowed to the crown prince. The crown prince repeatedly said he didn't dare. With him in the lead, everyone hurriedly bowed to Xueqing. Fan Xian smiled and said, "Sir Xue has returned to the capital to report on his work. I was rude. Thinking of how we have worked together in Jiangnan this year, I have received your favor, so I took the liberty to invite you over." Everyone made an "oh" sound and laughed that Sir Fan Jr.'s face was so big that he had even invited Governor Xue over. In their hearts, they wondered if it was because of the attack in the valley that Fan Xian wanted to demonstrate his might to some power that he had even brought Xueqing over. These major figures couldn't be blamed for thinking this. The banquet in Baoyue brothel could be considered a gathering of the younger generation. Old people like Director Chun and Shu the Scholar would not dare to disturb them. Even if they wanted to invite them, the emperor would probably not allow it. Furthermore, everyone was thinking why Fan Xian had invited so many people from different powers to gather in Baoyue brothel. It's just to eat, drink, and chat. Everyone has been busy with official business this year. It's nearing the end of the year, so you have to take a break. Fan Xian stood in front of Baoyue brothel's door and smiled as he explained. He then saw a group of people walk over. At the front was the second prince, the one who looked very similar to Fan Xian. His temperament and aura seemed to be carved from the same mold. Yet, he had fought with Fan Xian in Jingdou, the north, and Jiangnan until blood flowed like rivers. Of course, the temporary victor was Fan Xian. Fan Xian and the second prince met each other's eyes. With great tacit understanding, regardless of who was first or who was first, regardless of status, they raised their hands at the same time, slightly bent their waists and bowed. Then, the corners of their mouths twitched slightly. At the same time, a slightly bashful smile rose to their faces. The two of them sighed in their hearts. This smile had been missing for a long time. It's not about getting votes. Of course, those who have votes still have to vote for me. I've been a little busy lately, and I've had some minor emotional issues. I'll definitely report to everyone after the dust settles in a few days. My condition might be a little worse in the next few days, so I'll report to everyone in advance. Please understand, today's chapter can only be said to be about the same as usual, but the last 3 sentences were very beautiful. Let me be narcissistic. To be continued. If you want to know what happens next, please log on to www.chitian.com. There are more chapters. Chapter 460. On the east side of the 3rd floor of Balua Brothel was a large flower hall. Half of the building was empty, and one could just see the hall on the 1st floor below. The Waidu people's blanket suffused a fishy red color downstairs and had a different flavor. There were honored guests in the building, so this half of the flower hall had been emptied. When he entered the flower hall, the second prince's eyes unconsciously glanced toward the door and saw 2 words written in gold paint. He couldn't help but be curious as to what they meant. Hong Men. As the host, Fan Xian smiled calmly as he welcomed everyone into the hall. The flower hall was separated by screens and hanging velvet curtains. Steam rose. As soon as the important figures entered the flower hall, they had their cloaks taken off by the girls beside them, leaving them wearing only unlined clothing. It was enough. There were all kinds of exquisite tea and pastries placed on the table. The plates used were also good things from Jiangnan. The wine was held in the highest quality glass cups. The wine was the most expensive liquor in the world, Wu Yangye. The girls serving beside him were all outstanding beauties, gentle and silent. Naturally, the crown prince sat in the most honored position. He gazed at Fan Xian and laughingly scolded, "Only you can enjoy such good things. Look at the things here. They all come from the 3 large workshops. The palace still hopes to exchange them for silver. Who would dare to spend as freely as you do?" The Qing people were simple and honest. Even the royal officials were a bit more cautious. They were not at all as extravagant as the northern Qi court. The banquet Fan Xian had set up today was indeed a bit out of bounds. Everyone knew that the palace treasury was under Fan Xian's control. It would not be a problem for him to transfer some expenses. However, they didn't know if the crown prince was secretly stabbing them in the back when he said this with a chuckle. Fan Xian's expression did not change. He smiled and said, "If I can enjoy it, I should make the most of it." Naturally, Xueqing sat at the first table to the left. He had come by imperial edict to watch the show, so he did not mind much. Additionally, he had been in Jiangnan for a long time and seemed to be used to this kind of enjoyment. Seeing the admiration of these major figures in the capital, he couldn't help the corners of his mouth twitching slightly and smiling. He thought to himself that it was not easy to live in Jingdou. Unfortunately, the enjoyment was far inferior to that of Jiangnan. The banquet began. The girls were quiet and speechless. They began to place food and pour wine for the guests at each table. Although they had undergone special training these 2 days, when they abruptly opened their eyes and saw so many important figures in the Qing court, the girls still couldn't help but feel nervous. Their rosy lips pressed tightly together. The princes and officials in this hall had all rolled around in the brothels before, but to suddenly have so many people gathered in one hall, it was really a bit confusing. In fact, there weren't many guests, only about a dozen or so. Each of them had a girl sitting beside them, and behind them sat a close attendant. Even so, the reception hall was somewhat full. The person serving Fan Xian was none other than the shopkeeper of Balua Brothel, Sangwen. For an occasion like this, it was inappropriate to start drinking and talking at the beginning. Drinking orders were repeated, breasts and buttocks were touched, particularly with Xueqing and the 2 deputies of the Bureau of Military Affairs present. The young noblemen were still a bit proud of their status. For a moment, the hall was quiet and heavy. They only talked about some idle jokes in court, such as Scholar Shu collapsing drunk on the snowy street again yesterday. In any case, Shu Wu's personality was relaxed and didn't mind how the younger generation made fun of him. No one dared to use these princes and Fan Xian as a joke, particularly Fan Xian. Everyone was still guessing what the true purpose of this meal was. Amidst the awkwardness, Xueqing minded his own business and drank his wine. He grabbed the girl's small hand beside him and played with it. This man immediately shed the air of an official and gained the feeling of a middle-aged prodigal son. It looked like the scholars of the Library of Books had fought many battles with the skeletons of the Red Chamber. The second prince took a shallow sip and looked at Fan Xian across from him. He smiled slightly and said, "Enji, I haven't come to Baiwa Brothel in a year. I find that the girls here are much prettier than before." The atmosphere immediately relaxed. Between Fan Xian and the second prince, there had to be someone who would speak first. "Nonsense," Fan Xian laughingly scolded. "Given the lineup today, it is impossible for this Baiwa brothel to serve you well. I won't hide it from everyone. The 13 girls in this brothel are not just for my brothel. As long as it is the most famous girl in the capital, I have invited them all. Regardless of whether it is the pleasure boats on Lujing River or the musical house, if you can find another popular girl after you leave this brothel tonight, then I will lose." Everyone was startled and thought that this was quite a big move. It was not a matter of spending money. Rather, in one short day, he had made all of the brothel in Jingdo obediently offer up their most famous girls. Fan Xian's power had indeed reached a hair-raising level. Everyone turned their heads to look and saw the girls beside them had their heads lowered shyly. After a closer look, everyone couldn't help but laugh. They recognized that one was someone on Lujing River and the other was a girl from the musical house. They were all old acquaintances. Only the second prince's gaze dimmed a little. Speaking of which, it was absurd. Of the dozen or so girls in the brothel, for belonged to the Lujing River affairs that Li Hongsheng had previously been responsible for. However, Yuan Meng had died in Jiangnan, Shi Qing had defected to Fan Xian, and Li Hongsheng had been grounded by King Jing. He raised his head and glanced at Fan Xian from a distance. He saw that Fan Xian's expression was calm. However, there was a not-quite-there smile in his eyes. For a moment, he wasn't sure if Fan Xian wanted to use this small matter to demonstrate his might or if he had other thoughts. The second prince smiled slightly and said, "Baiweb Brothel's management is successful. Presumably, it is all because of Miss Sang's clever and discerning eyes. I offer you a toast." After saying this, he raised the wine cup in his hand and offered a toast to Sang won by Fan Xian's side. For him to address himself as a prince, it was in line with his usual gentleness. Moreover, in a romantic setting, it would be meaningless to just talk about seniority. The crowd did not mind, but they were curious. Why was the first toast to Sangwon? Where did this put the host of the day, Fan Xian? At this moment, Sangwon was leaning against Fan Xian's side. She picked up a strand of moss and brought it to his lips. Suddenly hearing these words, she couldn't help but start and turn her head to glance at Fan Xian. Fan Xian smiled slightly and nodded. Sangwon stood and bowed slightly toward the second prince. She drained the cup and did not wait for the second prince to say anything. She poured herself another cup and invited the crown prince and great prince, who were sitting at the head of the table. The crown prince was a bit strange today. He only cared about teasing the beauty in his arms. The beauty was being coaxed by the heir to the throne of a country. Her entire body had long gone soft. The crown prince looked very pleased and completely ignored the turbulent undercurrents between the second prince and Fan Xian at the banquet. However, the great prince and Sangwon drank a cup and sighed. The second prince's expression did not change. He smiled slightly and said, "It is rare for so many friends to be present today. There must be something to liven things up. Ever since Miss Sang became the shopkeeper of Baiwa Brothel, the people of Jingdo no longer have the good fortune to hear such things. I wonder if we can ask Miss Sangwon to sing a song?" Sangwon smiled slightly. Her gentle face was calm. She stood and was about to go get her zither when unexpectedly, her hand was pulled by Fan Xian. Fan Xian held Sangwon's hand and looked calmly at the second prince. "Sangwon doesn't sing anymore." Sangwon was startled and thought, why disturb the banquet over such a small matter? She had been a singer since she was young and had long gotten used to singing at banquets. For a moment, she had forgotten that Fan Xian was someone who was most unwilling to have his own people serve other people. The second prince furrowed his brows. A glimmer of confusion flashed across his handsome face. It was as if he had not thought Fan Xian would be so unyielding. After the banquet began, both sides had been testing each other's attitudes. He also wanted to know what Fan Xian was preparing to do after returning to the capital this time. Unexpectedly, Fan Xian's response was such a killjoy. Fan Xian glanced at the second prince. He thought to himself that he had created this scene today, but his goal was to kill the scene. Sitting below him, the official of Taichung Temple, Ren Xiaoyan, pulled on his sleeve and reminded him to be careful. He only smiled. The deputy of the Bureau of Military Affairs narrowed his eyes slightly and said, "Sir Fan Jr., what are you saying? Given the prince's status, what is wrong with having this girl present a song?" Fan Xian's confrontation in front of the Bureau of Military Affairs had long created a crack between him and the military. Each day that the attack in the valley was not investigated, the two sides would not be at peace. The Qing Kingdom's military had always been simple, direct, and crude. This deputy was Chu Xiangdong. He had been the vanguard of the last northern expedition. He had a great deal of military service, so he was not afraid of Fan Xian's power. Hearing Fan Xian's cold words, he spoke to stab him. Fan Xian did not get angry. He only smiled and said, "Lady Sang only sings in Qinggarden. If Deputy Chu wants to hear it, go outside the capital and ask Director Chen. There's no point in asking me." The words Director Chen were tossed out. The second prince smiled and didn't say anything more. The expression of the Deputy Chu of the Bureau of Military Affairs also changed. He forcefully swallowed the vicious words he was about to say back into his stomach. "Drink." Amidst the awkwardness, the great prince, who had been silent for a long time, suddenly raised his cup and roared. He had come from the military and had a bold personality. He had wanted to make up for Fan Xian's relationship with the military and, at the same time, make the gap between his brothers smaller. Seeing the strange situation at the banquet, a strange anger surged in his chest. The two deputies of the Bureau of Military Affairs also came from military. Their boldness was not inferior to others. They furrowed their brows slightly and drained the 3 liang wine cups in their hands in one gulp. Then, they flipped their wrists to demonstrate Fan Xian. Fan Xian smiled slightly and placed the cup to his lips. He slowly tipped it. Although his speed was slow, he did not stop. Like a clear spring entering a lake, the cup was emptied. The crown prince in the first seat helplessly raised his cup to the great prince and said, "Big brother, I was drinking." Your loud voice almost scared the wine out of my cup. Everyone laughed loudly. The crown prince then smiled at the two deputies of the Bureau of Military Affairs and said, "Don't think about bringing the military style to Baiyue brothel. I know there is some resentment between you, An, and Ji, but this matter has not been thoroughly investigated. Why should there be resentment between officials? Even if there is resentment, don't compete in drinking." He pointed at Fan Xian and smiled at the two deputies of the Bureau of Military Affairs. "Have you forgotten? The year before last, Sir Fan Jr. drank 3,000 cups in one night and made that Marquis of Northern Qi drink like a dead pig. When it comes to alcohol tolerance, and Ji is not afraid of you old men in the military." As a member of the Eastern Palace, Xian Chuwu knew what his master wanted to do. He quickly followed along and said, "Generals, I feel that there is no harm in competing in drinking with Sir Fan Jr. After that night, Sir Fan Jr. has not composed poetry. If we can make him write another 300 poems and have the Banksy anti-poetry anthology continue, the Bureau of Military Affairs will have done a great service to the world. I'm afraid even the emperor will be incomparably happy." After these words were said, everyone agreed. Even Xue Qing became interested. He invited Fan Xian to drink a few cups and then forced the two deputies of the Bureau of Military Affairs to compete in drinking with Fan Xian. After a mouthful of wine, the atmosphere immediately became much livelier. Fan Xian's boldness in drinking also made the two deputies of the Bureau of Military Affairs feel much better. The second prince suddenly smiled and said, "Speaking of Enji not composing poetry after that night, it is truly a great loss to the world. However, I heard that when Ji was in Northern Qi, he had written a small poem for that Northern Qi saint girl. I wonder if this is true. This was the most famous scandal in the world last year. The Northern Qi people were unhappy in their hearts, but the Qing Kingdom people were incomparably happy. Hearing these words, the slightly tipsy figures all began to make a ruckus. They insisted on hearing Fan Xian talk about the specifics of the story. Fan Xian smiled and scolded them. Naturally, he wouldn't go into detail. He casually brushed them off. Out of the corner of his eye, he glanced at the crown prince and felt a bit surprised. This crown prince was indeed much more promising than he was 2 years ago. However, the real power in the crown prince's hands was gradually decreasing. He just watched him and the second prince fight like this. Did he want to reap the benefits? But where did his confidence come from? He wasn't his father. The banquet gradually came to an end. Everyone's spirits gradually rose. The great prince stood and grabbed those people, forcing them to drink. Fan Xian snickered as he watched this scene. He thought that this person had probably been too strictly disciplined by the great princess of Northern Qi in his manner. Now that he finally had a chance to come out and be at ease, he wouldn't let this opportunity go. Fan Xian then looked at the crown prince, who seemed to be a bit drunk, while the second prince still maintained a sober expression. He couldn't help but smile slightly and open his mouth to say, "I haven't returned to Jingdo in a year. I rather miss everyone in the capital." His expression suddenly changed. He sighed sadly and said, "It's a pity that before we entered the capital, we were ambushed by bandits. 12 people died under my command. These people were all officials of the Overwatch Council, talents of the court. They worked hard for the court in Jiangnan and finally had the chance to return to Jingdo to reunite with their families. Yet, they died tragically a dozen li outside of Jingdo. Those women and children who were waiting for their return at home are probably still living in misery at home." He raised a strong wine in his cup and drained it in one gulp. In a low voice, he said, "Thinking of this wine, I really can't drink anymore." The flower hall on the 3rd floor of Baiyue Brothel suddenly quieted down. They knew that the highlight of the night had finally arrived. In a quiet little alley about 5 li away from Baiyue Brothel, a group of black-clothed people suddenly appeared at the mouth and end of the alley, blocking the alley tightly. The leader, Mu Tai, looked at the 3 people in the alley with a heavy expression. Pointing at the leader, he said, "Are you called Yang Gongsheng?" The leader's right hand slowly pressed against the bulge at his waist. Coldly, he said, "Yes, what advice do you have?" Mu Tai revealed his teeth in a smile. A strange expression flashed across his dark face. "I want to confirm your identity as one of the 8 generals in case you kill the wrong person." He then flashed his body and left. The 2 groups of black-clothed people at the mouth and end of the alley silently charged over. If you want to know what happened next, please log on to www.qitian.com. More chapters. Support the author. Support original reading. Chapter 461. Not only did I cosplay Wu Jinyu, but I also cosplayed The Godfather, the 60s and 70s, a series of great beloved ones. P.S. Among the 8 generals, there is no Yang surname. I messed it up yesterday, so I made do with it. Thank you for reminding me. Yang Gongsheng, one of the 8 generals. 8 generals, 8 generals. It seemed to be a simple description, but when these 3 words were put together, it had a completely different meaning. Everyone knew that this referred to the 8 aces the second prince secretly raised in his manor. These 8 aces always followed by the second prince's side and were one of the second prince's most powerful martial powers. In the battle between Fan Xian and the second prince the year before last, it was these 8 generals who had kept Fan Xian in the tea shop outside Baiyue Brothel. Although they did not manage to keep him, they still left a deep impression on Fan Xian. They were indeed 8 aces. Outside the Jingdo government, after the case closely related to Baiyue Brothel and Fan Xija had been tried, Fan Xian had attacked and shattered Xie Baiyan's spirit. Because of this, it had caused a problem with the Jinqi in his body. This was the first reason. Beside Yushan Road, in the autumn rain, the killers of the 6th Bureau of the Overwatch Council attacked, and silenced him with metal rods. This startled Fan Wujiu and caused him to disregard the second prince's entreaties to stay and float away. This was the second reason. Ever since that small battle that had not been announced to the world, there were only 6 of the second prince's 8 generals left. The second prince was a guest in Baiwa brothel. He was confident that Fan Xian would not dare to do anything to him. In order to appear sincere, he did not bring a single person and sent the remaining 6 generals back. Yang Gongcheng was one of them. On such a night, when he raised his head and saw nothing but white snow and layers of clouds covered the silver moon, he was blocked by a group of black-clothed men and cut off his path of retreat. The day had been bright and clear. The snow on the eaves of the alley turned into water and dripped down. The alley was cold and damp. As night fell, the water droplets decreased and gradually condensed into icicles. However, there was still a drop of water that gathered at the tip of the icicle, drooping and ready to drip. Yang Gongqing's pupils constricted slightly. With a flip of his hand, he pulled out the sword at his waist. The tip of his foot pushed off the ground, and his entire body had already shot up. The icicle broke in the middle with a chi sound, turning into a sharp light that pierced towards the black-clothed man in front of him. Yang Gongcheng then stepped on the shoulders of his 2 companions, pointing them towards the 2 black-clothed men who were attacking from both sides. His figure had already risen and was about to reach the top of the alleyway. He knew that this was an ambush that had been premeditated for a long time. The other party had figured out his daily route, which was why they had trapped him in the alley. But he didn't want to die, so he would rather sacrifice his 2 companions, or rather his disciples, and use them as sandbags to block the blade so that he would have time to escape. It was escape, not resistance. At this time, Yang Gongqing had long lost his drive. There were not many people who dared to ambush and kill people in the capital, and the only person who had a grudge against the second prince was that person. That person had sent people to kill him, and they were not people he could fight against. It had to be said, Yang Gongqing was worthy of being one of the second prince's 8 personal generals. His reaction speed and methods of dealing with the situation were the best of the best. When the black-clothed men below groaned and knocked his disciples to the ground, and at the same time split apart the icicles that carried his true power, he had already swept into the air. He only needed a moment to step onto the alleyway and escape into the night sky. Unfortunately, the assassin did not give him this moment. A crossbow arrow flew over silently, piercing straight towards his chest. Yang Gongqing groaned. With a flick of his wrist, he chopped downwards. In the time it took for a spark to fly off a flint, he chopped down the crossbow arrow. But since the crossbow arrow had shot out, naturally there was more than one. Whoosh, 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 whoosh. Over 10 crossbow arrows shot out at the same time. He was in midair. How could he block them? Although he relied on his high cultivation to forcefully block a few crossbow arrows aimed at his vitals, he still let a few crossbow arrows that slipped through the net sink deep into his thigh. Yang Gongqing's thigh was in pain and numb. His eyes looked like they were going to pop out. He fell from midair in despair. He only had the time to jump out of the alleyway for a moment. In that moment, he saw 7 crossbowmen standing on the eaves of the houses in the alleyway. They were in different positions, but they blocked the top of the alleyway. There were assassins below and crossbowmen above. It was an inescapable net. How could he escape? While Yang Gongqing was falling, he wanted to shout for help. From the corner of his eyes, he saw that the black-clothed men in the alleyway had also taken out crossbow arrows. An incoming crossbow arrow shot into his mouth. Blood splattered, forcing him to stop shouting. At that moment, he thought in despair. Why did the opponent bring so many crossbows to deal with a small fry like him? The crossbow arrows were too concentrated. While he was in midair, his body had already been hit by dozens of crossbow arrows. He looked like a laughable hedgehog. With a paw, Yang Gongqing's body fell into the snowy water, shaking up a puddle of blood. But his cultivation was really high. Even after suffering such a heavy injury, he still did not stop breathing. He knelt on one knee and used his sword to support himself. Looking at the leader of the black-clothed men who was getting closer and closer to him, his eyes revealed a trace of the frenzied savagery of a dying beast. Yes, he was an expert. But an expert who was ambushed by dozens of crossbows could not do anything unless he was Eluyan. Fresh blood flowed down the densely packed crossbow shafts, flowing out his essence, chi, spirit, blood, and soul. Yang Gongqing's throat gurgled, but he refused to collapse. The leader of the black-clothed men walked in front of him. With a backhand, he pulled out the straight blade at his waist. The blade was as bright as snow, without a speck of dust. The majority of the icicles on the eaves of the alley had already been chopped off, leaving only a few lonely icicles. The snowy water that had been accumulating for a long time finally converged into a large round bead of water. It dripped down, dripping into the bloody water in the alley with a light sound. The leader of the black-clothed men pulled out his blade and silently chopped down. With one strike, Yang Gongqing's head fell off cleanly. Yang Gongqing's headless body remained kneeling. The black-clothed leader waved his hand. The crossbowmen standing on top of the houses flipped over and fell to the ground. The assassins in the alley silently moved forward and took away all the crossbow arrows. Then, they erased all traces in the alley. The group of people took off their black clothes and disguised themselves as ordinary commoners. They left the alley and merged into the seemingly unchanging life of the capital. The alleyway was quiet, as if no one had ever been there. However, there were 3 more corpses. Without the support of the crossbow bolts, the headless corpses finally fell and smashed into the alleyway with a dull thud. In the past, I had never thought that something like crossbow arrows would be so terrifying. Fan Xian raised his wine cup and slowly drank. His eyes were full of confusion. You all know that the Overwatch Council is also used to using crossbows. But I still did not think that when something used to kill reaches a certain level, it would become so terrifying. At the banquet in Baiwa Brothel, everyone listened quietly to Fan Xian's narration. This was the details of the attack in the valley. Everyone could hear the glimmer of melancholy and coldness in Fan Xian's words. Fan Xian placed his wine cup on the table and smiled slightly. A sky full of crossbow rain. I have never seen it in this life. Presumably, I also never saw it in my previous life. This was not an attack. It was more like on the battlefield. Only then did I realize that a single person's strength is indeed limited. The great prince slowly nodded his head across from him. A complicated expression appeared on his face. Perhaps he was thinking of the years of fighting with the Hu tribes during the Wester expedition. The sound of the crossbow arrows hitting the carriage was like a soul-stealing drum. Fan Xian furrowed his brows. It was as if he was recalling the specific circumstances at the time. That feeling of being surrounded and killed was not good. The crown prince sighed and comforted him. Fortunately, it is already over. And Ji, you're able to survive. Those rebels and traitors will be punished one day. The court is currently investigating. Presumably, there will be a result in a few days. Thank you, Your Highness. Fan Xian raised his cup to everyone and smiled. Yes, at least I survived. Presumably, many people will be disappointed. Even the city guarding crossbows were used, yet they were still unable to kill me. What does this mean? No one replied to his words. The expressions of the 2 deputies of the Bureau of Military Affairs were not good. Without question, the attack in the valley involved the military. Although the court's investigation had not yielded any results, this was already an ironclad fact. When Fan Xian spoke to this point, the military elders could not help but secretly speculate. I am a very confident person. Fan Xian indicated that he had already finished his cup. Fan Xian indicated that he had already finished his cup and smiled. Including the emperor and the director, the elders have all asked me why you are so confident. Everyone listened attentively, but a feeling of absurdity grew in their hearts. At this moment, all the important figures of the Qin kingdom were present, as well as the crown prince and 3 princes. However, once Fan Xian opened his mouth, everyone's attention would be drawn to him. This was not only because he was the host of the banquet. It was also because everyone seemed to unconsciously admit that he was the person with the most power. This was truly absurd. Perhaps in history, there had been powerful officials who overturned the court and were known as 9,000-years-old eunuchs. However, there had never been such a young and intimidating illegitimate child of the royal family, and a dazzling one at that. Everyone unconsciously glanced at the Crown Prince. The Crown Prince was smiling slightly as he listened to Fan Xian speak. There was not a trace of unease in his expression. On the contrary, it was filled with comfort and understanding. The great prince coughed gently. Fan Xian's left hand gently played with a large wine goblet. His gaze looked at the 1-foot table in front of him, as if he was looking at a beautiful scene. Why am I so confident? Because I believe that I am the luckiest person in the world. No one's luck can be better than mine. A person who had clearly died had mysteriously come back to life and had lived such a colorful and even bizarre life. This kind of luck needed to be slowly celebrated in the years to come. Fan Xian smiled and said, I said earlier that the Overwatch Council is also used to using crossbows. Those crossbows cannot kill me. My enemies will certainly not be as lucky as me. In the Overwatch Council, not far from the Royal Palace, in a secret room that Director Chun liked to stay in, Yin Bingyun was wearing a pure white cotton robe. He stared at the files on the table in a daze. A moment later, he sighed and rubbed his temples. He felt that the soreness there was difficult to stop. There was a knock on the door. An official of the 2nd Bureau's Intelligence Department flashed in and handed him 3 small bamboo tubes sealed with wax. Yin Bingyun used his fingernail to pry open the wax seal. He took out the intelligence report inside and scanned it. He then brought it closer to a candle to the side and burned it. Under the strange gaze of the intelligence official, he said tiredly, Tonight's matter will not be recorded. The official of the Intelligence Department immediately lowered his head in acknowledgement and said, Of the 43 targets, 3 have already been eliminated. Yin Bingyun seemed to have a headache. Hearing these words, he shook his head in annoyance and waved his hand to indicate that he understood and had him leave. The secret room returned to silence. Yin Bingyun looked at the remaining pieces of wax on the table and became lost in thought again. Tonight, Fan Xian was holding a banquet in Baiwa Brothel while the Overwatch Council was in a second-level state. In the darkness of Jingdo, who knew how many people were moving and how many would die? All of this was because of Fan Xian's madness. Tonight's plan had been personally drawn up by Yin Bingyun. Although he had expressed his firm opposition to it in front of Fan Xian, he still had to continue doing what needed to be done. In this plan, he had to kill 11 people and capture 32. Of the 11 targets that had to be eliminated first, 6 of them were the 2nd Prince's 8 generals. This was a crazy act of revenge. 3 of the 2nd Prince's 8 generals had already died. Given the Overwatch Council's frenzied counterattack, the power of a mere manor could not shake the overall situation. Presumably, they would soon receive news of the other people's deaths. Yin Bingyun walked to the window and lifted a corner of the black cloth covering the window. Just like Shin Pingping had done in the past, he looked through the narrow space toward the royal palace not far away. The royal palace was still bright and exuded a holy and lofty aura through the black clothing. He gazed at the royal palace, full of worry, and thought, The emperor wants you to be a lonely official, not a heartless official. To be continued. If you want to know what happens next, please log on to www.chidian.com. More chapters. Support the author. Support original reading. Chapter 462. The night in the capital was always deep, especially in such a cold winter. After nightfall, there were not many pedestrians on the streets. No, it should be said that there were no pedestrians at all. There were no pedestrians, only night walkers. Who knew how many night walkers used the cover of the night to appear under the eaves of the streets and alleys of the capital? They used the nooses, sharp blades, iron drills, chains on the doors, and powder in their arms to wrap around someone's neck, cut someone's throat, tear someone's body, or blind someone's eyes. Blood blinded everyone's eyes. In Purple Bamboo Park, a black rope hung down from the main gate. A person was struggling on the rope, his feet kicking helplessly in the cold wind. The lantern was very dark. Just like the rope, it swayed slowly in the cold wind, casting shadows and faint light randomly on the ground. At the corner of the street, Deng Ziyu's pale face flickered. He He looked like a devil in the night. He stared at that person, and after confirming that he was dead, he turned and left. In Gilly Lane, inside a brothel, the red waves were rolling. On the bed, the expert with strong muscles suddenly opened his eyes. His white eyes were seeping with blood. The prostitute on his body looked at him coldly. Her legs were wide open, but she tightly gripped his waist. Her posture was obscene and fatal. After an unknown amount of time, the prostitute's delicate white hands slowly moved away from the man's ears. She pulled out two extremely thin iron drills. The drills glowed with a faint blue light and a pitch-black color of blood. In Gaoshan Tower, a chaotic sound of pursuit rang out. A person panicked and ran down the tower with a face full of fear. The clothes on his body had already been cut into countless pieces and were dripping with blood. A moment later, he was blocked by his pursuers under the tower. The black-clothed man who was chasing him spat out a mouthful of bloody saliva and waved his hand. The black-clothed men rushed up and surrounded the man. Although the man was highly skilled in martial arts and resisted with all his might, he was still like a whale surrounded by a school of sharks. Gradually, he was unable to hold on. In the dark night, only the muffled sounds of metal piercing into flesh and the sound of the cold wind could be heard. The black-clothed men silently stabbed and swung until the man in the middle no longer had any reaction. He did not even have the slightest neurological reaction. He only crawled on the ground like a piece of rotten meat. Yin Bingyin placed the report on the candle flame and burned it. His hands did not tremble, and his brows were no longer furrowed. Since it had already happened, there was no room for doubt. It was just like after a crossbow was pulled. No one could make the arrow that could kill disappear in a thin air. The 8 generals of the Second Prince personally led numbered 6. They had all died to the Overwatch Council's attacks. Through different methods and different places, they disappeared into the darkness of Jingdo. From today onwards, the name of the 8 generals would become a stale name in history. Perhaps it would not even be qualified to leave a mark in history. Yin Bingyin looked down at the piece of paper on the table and subconsciously pinched the bridge of his nose to clear his mind. According to the plan, it was time to move on to the next step. As for the remaining 5 people to be killed, there were already specialized people to take care of them. The plan was linked to each other. Although it was the Overwatch Council's crazy revenge for the attack in the valley, Yin Bingyin still had to think of a way to control the situation to a certain extent. The Second Prince's 8 generals were not officials. They were just private generals in the manor. For people like this, as long as the Overwatch Council killed them cleanly and left no evidence, the court would not be able to do anything to Fan Xian. However, those 5 people were different. The officials to be captured next were also different. Although they were unremarkable figures in various departments, they were, after all, paid by the court. What kind of trouble would it cause to capture so many in one night? Yin Bingyin sighed. Through a secret mechanism, he notified his subordinates outside to come in and gave a second order. After giving the order, he habitually walked to the window and gazed into the distance at a corner of the palace wall, not far away. He thought to himself that what the director had said was correct. Under the cover of Fan Xian's gentle appearance, there was indeed an element of madness hidden. Presently, only a dozen trusted aides had died in the valley, and Fan Xian had already gone crazy. If it was really as the director said, and the day the director passed away, what kind of terrifying person would Fan Xian become? In Baiwa Brothel, Fan Xian's expression was very warm and calm. His eyebrows were slightly raised with an indescribable comfort. It was as if he had no idea what was happening in Jingdo at night outside the brothel. He had already finished talking about the attack in the valley. Regardless of whether the officials at the banquet had lingering fears or regrets, they all expressed their condolences to him. Immediately after, he briefly talked about the Jiangnan matter, the Ming family matter, and the palace treasury matter. He then furrowed his brows and said, "Actually, there is something I don't understand. When I was working for the court in Jiangnan, why did there always be people who liked to cause trouble in the capital?" Everyone at the banquet was slightly startled. They wondered to themselves what exactly he was talking about. During the year Fan Xian was far away in Jiangnan, It was impossible to say that there were no people in Jingdo who tripped him up. But if you were talking about tripping him up one a day for 365 days, which one were you talking about? Was it investigating the Ministry of Revenue? Or was it sending books into the palace? Furthermore, these trippings had long been torn apart by those old fellows. You were completely fine, so why are you here wailing? The crown prince couldn't resist laughing and scolding. Where did all these grievances come from? There are certainly people who are not on your side, but you can't name anyone who is purposely dragging you down. Fanxian also smiled and shook his head. It's just that I haven't been back to Jingdo this year. I think perhaps many people in Jingdo have already forgotten what kind of personality I have. The second prince was holding a wine cup and carefully tasting it. Hearing these words, for some reason, a chill rose in his heart. Tonight, the crown prince's behavior was too strange, and Fanxian's attitude was too arrogant. It was arrogant to the point that it did not make sense and did not conform to the rules. It did not benefit him at all. Was it because of the matter in the valley that he was in a hurry? The second prince's brows furrowed together nicely. He thought to himself, we still haven't found out who did it. What's the point of messing around with us here? At this moment, the Baiwa brothel suddenly became lively. Hearing the sound of horse hooves, it seemed that many people were heading this way. The crown prince, who was sitting at the head, furrowed his brows and said unhappily, who dares to make a ruckus here? Everyone at the table furrowed their brows and looked out the window. It seemed that someone wanted to enter Baiwa brothel and had already successfully passed through the Jingdo garrison and Jingdo government bailiff's double line of defense. However, they were stopped outside the building by the people of Baiwa brothel. Fanxian glanced at Sangwon. Sangwon understood and lifted the velvet curtain to flash past the side of the screen. In a moment, following a wave of hurried footsteps, Sangwon brought 5 people up the stairs. These 5 people were all wearing official robes, presumably officials of the imperial court. However, today was not a place to discuss important matters of the imperial court, but a place of pleasure. Everyone at the banquet recognized some of them as their trusted aides and couldn't help but be startled. They wondered what kind of game they were playing. Why would they come looking for them so openly? Could it be that something big had happened in the capital? The 5 officials met each other's eyes. They could all see the unease, fear, and panic in each other's hearts. Without caring about anything else, they first apologized to the nobles at the banquet and then glanced fearfully at Fanxian. They bowed to Fanxian and, without avoiding gossip, went to the banquet to find the person they were looking for and moved close to his ear to speak. Fanxian smiled slightly as he watched this scene. He raised his wine cup and toasted Run Xiao, who was beside the crown prince and the great prince. The great prince's imperial army system was clearly limited to the forbidden areas of the palace. His reaction was a bit slow. However, the crown prince seemed to have guessed something. Today, he had purposely cut off his own eyes and ears. He had only come to Baiwa brothel to get drunk. The great prince looked at the tense situation around him and furrowed his brows as he glanced at Fanxian. It was as if he was questioning him. Fanxian shook his head to indicate that he didn't know what had happened. On the other side, the expressions of the important figures who were listening to the reports from their subordinates gradually became unsightly, especially the second prince. His delicate and handsome face gradually became pale, and a trace of red quickly surged up, but after 3 breaths, it returned to normal. Fanxian watched this scene with slanted eyes. He knew that the other party already knew the news of the death of the 8 generals. He had not thought that the second prince would be able to immediately control his state of mind. He couldn't help but feel slight admiration. The great prince furrowed his brows and asked, "What happened?" Everyone in the restaurant knew something had happened, but not everyone knew exactly what had happened. The second prince lowered his head slightly and raised his wine cup to take a shallow sip. Raising his head to look at Fanxian, the smile in his eyes was slightly serious. Enunciating each word, he asked, "Sir Fan Jr. must know." The atmosphere was icy cold. The people who had received the news from Jingdo all stared at Fanxian's face. They already knew that while they were feasting in Baiwa brothel, A few murders had suddenly occurred in Jingdo. The 8 most capable generals of the Second Prince had been completely wiped out. These major figures had many eyes and ears in Jingdo. There were also the officials of the Bureau of Military Affairs responsible for the defense of the city. Of course, they knew how terrifying this kind of thing was, particularly to kill the 8 generals so cleanly and efficiently. The power needed was not something a normal person could possess. Thinking of how Fan Xian had invited everyone to bow to a brothel, everyone faintly guessed that this matter was done by the Overwatch Council. Everyone was waiting for Fan Xian's reply. The atmosphere at the banquet was murderous and silent. Fan Xian asked warmly, "What is it?" The Second Prince smiled. There was some bitterness in his smile. There was a slight coldness in the depths of his heart. His legs were a little sore and numb. Looking at the young commissioner of the Overwatch Council across from him, it was as if he was looking at a smiling demon. As a prince, he didn't know what kind of reaction he should immediately make. Thus, he raised his cup and drank, emptying it in one gulp. There was a slight burning pain in his chest. After a moment of silence, the deputy of the Bureau of Military Affairs, Chu Xiangdong, stared into Fan Xian's eyes and said in a cold voice, "Murders have occurred one after another tonight. 6 generals of the Second Prince's manor have been killed at the same time. Does Sir Fan, Jr. know of this matter?" After these words were said, the great prince, who didn't know what had happened, looked at Fan Xian in astonishment. Even the crown prince, who had been in the arms of a beauty pretending to be confused, let out a surprised cry and abruptly sat up from the beauty's arms. The crown prince looked at Fan Xian's calm expression in a daze. He was incomparably shocked. He knew that Fan Xian did not have any good intentions today, but he truly had not thought that Fan Xian's counterattack would be so simple, direct, violent, unreasonable, and without fear of consequences. Under everyone's gaze, Fan Xian tilted his head. With a glimmer of confusion and disdain, he quietly said, "Oh, they're all dead?" At this moment, the Second Prince was about to put down his wine cup. Hearing Fan Xian's question, the emotions in his chest swayed. The anger, frustration, a glimmer of confusion, and a glimmer of hatred finally couldn't be controlled. When the cup fell, it was slightly heavy. The wine cup landed on the table with a bang and knocked the wine goblet beside it askew. From the expressions of everyone at the banquet, he knew that the 6 generals were all dead. Fan Xian's heart felt as if a sweet spring had flowed through it. He didn't purposely hide his expression. Smiling slightly, he said, "How can the Second Prince's family generals ask me? I've always heard that the Second Prince's family generals walk very arrogantly in Jingdo. Perhaps they have offended someone they can't afford to offend." This was the first time he had referred to himself as an official since the banquet began. As for who in Jingdo the 8 generals had offended but couldn't afford to offend, it was clear that person's surname was Fan. The banquet was silent. The Second Prince stared at Fan Xian's face in a daze and suddenly smiled. He knew that regardless of whether or not Fan Xian had done this, for the Overwatch Council to have the ability to completely wipe out his martial power in such a short time at the banquet, the Overwatch Council's power was not something he, a prince, could face head-on. He raised his cup to Fan Xian and said sincerely, "Commissioner, good methods, good courage." Fan Xian raised his cup in greeting and said comfortingly, "Your Highness, my condolences. The dead don't go, the living don't come. Metabolism is always like this." The deputy of the Bureau of Military Affairs looked at the 2 seemingly similar princes in front of him. An absurd feeling involuntarily rose in the depths of his heart. Looking at it now, the Second Prince was far from being a match for Fan Xian. However, in terms of title, Fan Xian was, after all, an official. Where did he get such audacity from? Chu Xiangdong suddenly felt that he was old and timid, but he still couldn't resist opening his mouth to ask Fan Xian, "Sir Fan Jr., you should know about the Overwatch Council moving out everywhere tonight and capturing dozens of court officials, right?" Fan Xian carefully placed the wine cup back on the table with both hands. He raised his head and said, "I am the commissioner of the Overwatch Council and the head of the First Bureau. By imperial order, I oversee the governance of Jingdo. If I don't nod, who dares to capture those vermin?" I had wanted to continue describing the conversation and killing in detail, using the inside and outside of the building as a comparison. Hymns rang out. Snowflakes fell. Were there any pigeons? Suddenly, I didn't want to write like that because it was too slow. This paragraph would take 60 to 70,000 words, so I changed it. I felt a bit helpless, but I was actually quite interested. There was another important point. Don't think of this matter as too exciting just because of the excitement of killing. In a hierarchical society, a society of slave masters and slaves, if it were to evolve into a war between slave masters, this bit of blood right now would not be enough. Someone nodded. Someone was doing something. Violence was killing people. Yes, the situation in Jingdo was like that. Fan Xian was actually like the old Qin master. He also liked to be simple, direct, and crude. He needed this kind of atmosphere. Although he was confident, he was not as perversely confident as the emperor. To be continued. If you want to know what happened next, please log on to www.chijian.com. More chapters. Support the author. Support original reading. Chapter 463. In this world, there were no officials who were not greedy. The only thing that mattered was whether one was greedy or greedy. The court was full of vermin, and the only thing that mattered was whether the vermin was fat or thin. If it wasn't so, why would there suddenly be a strange department called the Overwatch Council in the Qin court? Just as Fan Xian had discovered during the rectification in the First Bureau, the Overwatch Council was also made up of people. Where there were people, there would be officialdom. It was impossible for the Overwatch Council to remain so cold and strict for the rest of its life. Furthermore, the Overwatch Council was not an immortal. It could not control anything above the third level. If the emperor did not issue an edict, it could not control military matters. Even if Chun, Ping, and Fan Xian worked together, the Overwatch Council would not be able to change much of the current situation. In the end, the Overwatch Council was not investigating corrupt officials. It was only following the emperor's wishes to clean up the government from time to time, quell the people's anger, and make some space to maintain its rule. If it really wanted to investigate, how long would it take for the beauties in Chun Ping's garden and the money Fan Xian had scooped up in the palace treasury to spit out, let alone the emperor sitting in the royal palace? The emperor did not need to be greedy. He was the most greedy person in the world. If he was greedy for the entire world, what could the Overwatch Council do? It was precisely because everyone was greedy that when the Overwatch Council wanted to do something because of Fan Xian's madness, it seemed to come naturally and naturally. In this dark night, the entire First Bureau of the Overwatch Council moved out and headed toward the mansions in the alleys and street corners. They captured countless lower-level officials who had close ties to the Second Prince and Xinjiang. Naturally, they could not touch anyone above the third level, but these lower-level officials were the ones the court truly needed to rely on. Everyone in Baiwa Brothel already knew of the Overwatch Council's earlier actions. They had also received Fan Xian's personal confirmation. They couldn't help but show shocked expressions on their faces. The deputy of the Bureau of Military Affairs, Chu Xiangdong, fell silent. He looked deeply at Fan Xian and didn't say anything more. Although the news tonight was not clear, it could be seen that the Overwatch Council's first target was still Xinjiang and the Second Prince's faction. They did not have deep connections with the military. Although he didn't understand why Fan Xian would suddenly use such a low-level method, the Overwatch Council's actions and Fan Xian's ruthlessness already made him feel a glimmer of fear. The beauty in the building was in his arms, killing and arresting people outside the building. Even if there was snow, how could it completely cover up the smell of blood? Not everyone sank into silence because of this sudden news. After the 5 reporting officials carefully retreated behind the screen, the Great Prince looked at Fan Xian with a heavy expression and asked, "Why?" The conflict between the Overwatch Council and the Xinjiang faction had been going on for a long time. It began 6 years ago with the dispute over the palace treasury. It was buried in the Second Prince's attempt to assassinate Fan Xian on Yolan Street under the pretext of a banquet. It was also because of the story of that autumn in the Baiwa brothel where everyone was sitting. That autumn, Fan Xian took over the Baoyu house, killed Xie Baiyan, and plotted against the capital government. He ruined the reputation of the second prince and Li Hongcheng, the son of King Jing. He also made the Cui family in the north look like traitors. In the year after autumn, Fan Xian went to the Ming family in Jiangnan, collected the palace treasury, and killed Chang Kuan and Jiaozhou. In everyone's eyes, Fan Xian's revenge against the second prince and the Xinyang faction was already severe enough, and he had reaped enough benefits. There was no reason for him to act so tyrannically again tonight. Fan Xian was silent for a moment and then calmly said, "Why?" "Because I am under orders to investigate the governance of officials." The banquet was silent. The crown prince sat high up and did not look at Fan Xian. Instead, he looked at the second prince's expression with a difficult-to-read expression. The great prince shook his head and sighed. "There is no peace in Jingdo for more than 2 days. Why can't you all calm down a bit?" Fan Xian knew the great prince was speaking from the bottom of his heart. This current commander of the imperial army had been on good terms with the second prince since childhood. Because of Lady Ning and Wan'er, he was now standing on his side. Placed in this situation, it was difficult to avoid being in a difficult position. Hearing these words, he couldn't resist sighing. "Peace? I haven't returned to the capital for a year. It looks like Jingdo has been peaceful for a whole year. Perhaps I am truly a star of misfortune. No wonder no one was willing to let me have peace in the valley outside Jingdo." The banquet was silent again. All the important figures faintly understood that this was Fan Xian finding a scene for the valley matter. However, this scene was a bit too big and absurd. There are many things in this world that are absurd. Fan Xian seemed to know what these important figures were thinking and said self-mockingly, "Just like the matter of me being assassinated in the valley. The court has been investigating, but because there is no evidence, they have never been able to come up with an explanation." He slowly said, "Who will pay attention to my subordinate?" As I said before, when my coachman was shot by the first arrow, I wanted to snatch him back into the carriage, but he stood up and blocked the arrow for me. I often ask myself, if I can't find any evidence, what can I do for him? The Jiangnan governor, Xue Qing, glanced meaningfully at Fan Xian. The crown prince slowly said, "Naturally, the court will investigate." This was the third time he had said these words tonight. Fan Xian nodded and smiled. "It is this matter that suddenly made me think of a story I heard a long time ago. Once upon a time in the forest, there was a little white rabbit. It happily left the door early in the morning. Then it met a big bad wolf. The big bad wolf grabbed the little white rabbit and slapped it twice. Slap, slap, slap. I told you not to wear a hat." Everyone looked at each other. They didn't know why Fan Xian would suddenly tell such a childish story. They only heard Fan Xian continue. The next day, the little white rabbit put on a hat and went out again. As it walked, it met the big bad wolf again. The big bad wolf grabbed the little white rabbit again. Slap, slap. I told you to wear a hat. The little white rabbit was very depressed and ran to the tiger to complain about the big bad wolf. The tiger listened to the little white rabbit's complaint and said painfully, "Don't worry, I will uphold justice for you." Then the tiger found the big bad wolf and said, "Old wolf, this morning the little white rabbit came to complain about you. It says you keep bullying it. See if you can find another reason to beat it. For example, you can say, 'Rabbit, go find me a piece of meat.' If it finds a fat one, you can say you want a thin one. If it finds a thin one, you can say you want a fat one. That way, you can beat it again. Otherwise, you can have it help you find a female rabbit. If it finds a plump one, you can say you like a slim one. If it finds a slim one, you can say you like a plump one." Fan Xian told the story very seriously, but the words he used were childish and absurd. However, everyone at the table revealed thoughtful expressions, including the crown prince and Xue Qing. They faintly understood who the tiger was referring to, but no one dared to show their expressions. Fan Xian drank a mouthful of wine and said seriously. After the old wolf heard this, he was very happy and repeatedly praised the tiger for being smart. However, their conversation was heard by the little white rabbit weeding outside the house. Very coincidental? However, stories cannot be written without coincidences. Continue. Fan Xian smiled coldly. On the third day, the little white rabbit went out again and met the big bad wolf again. The big bad wolf said, "Rabbit, go find me a piece of meat." The little white rabbit said, "Do you want a fat one or a thin one?" The big bad wolf furrowed his brows and smiled. In his heart, he thought, "Fortunately, there is a second move." "Never mind, I don't want meat. Go find me a female rabbit." The little white rabbit said, "Do you like a plump one or a slim one?" Fan Xian furrowed his brows tightly and shook his head. "Meeting such a cunning rabbit, what do you think we should do?" Everyone at the table also began to wonder what the big bad wolf would do next. They couldn't help but be curious as to what Fan Xian would say next. Fan Xian pressed his slightly dry lips together and smiled. The big bad wolf paused for a moment. He slapped the little white rabbit twice and scolded, "I told you not to wear a hat. I told you not to wear a hat." The most unreasonable, shameless, senseless, and nonsensical reason in the world was the most adequate reason. In other words, there was no need for a reason. What mattered was whose fist was bigger. Fan Xian finally said seriously, "I don't want to continue being a little white rabbit. I want to be a big bad wolf." This was a joke he had heard in his previous life. Speaking of it tonight, it was heavy. Everyone at the table should have roared with laughter, but at this moment, no one laughed. Everyone sighed in their hearts. The matter of the attack on Fan Xian in the valley would probably never be investigated clearly. Tonight, the Overwatch Council assassinating the 8 generals, in a situation where there was no evidence and Fan Xian did not admit to it, would never be investigated clearly. The matters of the world were like this. Since they could not find sufficient reasons for their natural enmity, then what need was there to find reasons? The field of power was like a wild mountain, where wolves chased rabbits and tigers watched from the side. It was natural. Although the banquet was not broken, these major figures had long lost the will to continue. The officialdom of Jingdo had already been unable to calm down. Tonight, it was even more embarrassing. Although the Overwatch Council was using the night to act and presumably would not disturb too many Jingdo people, these major figures still rushed back to their manors and yamens to deal with the aftermath. At the same time, they were mentally and officially preparing to welcome the new situation. Fan Xian walked Xueqing to the door. Before Xueqing left, he turned his head and smiled warmly. "Wolves are social animals. Don't turn yourself into a lone wolf. That is always dangerous." Fan Xian's heart warmed slightly. He bowed in thanks. Xueqing was silent for a moment. He then said, "Although the emperor has nodded his head, you still have to watch your limits, particularly the court's face." Fan Xian once again agreed. After the carriages of the few important figures slowly left the Baoyu brothel, the crown prince stretched lazily and walked down with the beauty in his arms. There were already servants by his side who draped the expensive fur coat over his body. The crown prince glanced at Fan Xian and smiled. Tonight's show was quite entertaining. The crown prince sent away the woman beside him and the idlers around them. Looking at Fan Xian calmly, he said, "Speaking of which, that autumn a year ago when I saw the first half of the show you and second brother acted out, I also thought it was entertaining. Thinking about it carefully, there was nothing between you and me." Fan Xian froze slightly. He didn't know what this crown prince, who was acting very differently than usual, meant. "There has never been a problem between you and me." The crown prince closed his eyes slightly and slowly said, "If there is a problem, it is a problem from back then. It should not become a problem between you and me. I hope you remember this." Fan Xian understood that he and the crown prince had actually always maintained a kind of peace. However, because of the matter the empress had participated in, they had become natural enemies. He didn't understand what the crown prince was planning to do by saying this. However, Fan Xian believed that the crown prince would not watch as he killed his mother in order to fight for his support. Thus, he was just saying it. No one had left, but the seat was empty. Strangely, the second prince stayed behind. He watched Fan Xian walk up from downstairs and smiled slightly. Slowly placing his left hand on the table, he did his best to suppress the absurd feeling in the depths of his heart. Using 2 fingers, he picked up a green fruit from the south and slowly chewed on it. Fanxian sat across from him and picked up the wine pot. He began to pour and drink by himself. Suddenly, he finished 10 cups. The great prince hugged the wine pot and drank heartily to the side. It was as if he wanted to get drunk. Fanxian put down his wine cup and clapped his hands. The third prince obediently walked out from behind the curtain. He glanced at his big brother and second brother with some difficulty and then sat beside his teacher. The great prince glanced at Fan Xian disapprovingly. His eyes seemed to be saying, "Why drag me into the affairs of adults?" In the flower hall on the third floor of Baiwa Brothel, there were 3 princes and Fan Xian. If one did not count the crown prince who had left earlier, the Qing emperor's bloodline in this world could be considered complete. The earlier banquet at Hongmen had become a family banquet with a strange atmosphere. "You're afraid." The second prince put down the half-eaten green fruit and stared into Fan Xian's eyes as he spoke in a gentle voice. Fan Xian's hand, holding the wine cup, froze. He slowly replied, "What am I afraid of? If you're not afraid, why did you make such a big move tonight?" The second prince smiled slightly and gently said, "Only someone with fear in their heart would act recklessly like you did tonight. You killed my general and captured my trusted aide. Does that have any effect on the big picture?" Fan Xian took a deep breath. His expression calmed. "There are no outsiders here, so there is no harm in speaking frankly. Your subordinates have been cleaned out by me today, but you have no evidence. Just as I said earlier, I also have no evidence regarding the attack in the valley, but you still did it." "I did not know about the attack in the valley. I did not participate." The second prince stared into Fan Xian's eyes and said seriously. Fan Xian shook his head. "What about the Niulan Street matter? Little White has been slapped in the face too many times. I admit that I still don't know who did it in the valley, but that doesn't stop me from taking action." He lowered his head and said, "There were enemies on all sides. Since I didn't know which enemy did it, of course, I had to release random arrows. If I occasionally hit the person in question, it would be an advantage for me. If I hit someone else, I would not lose out. It would be an advantage." Niulan Street. A glimmer of bitterness flashed through the smile on the second prince's thin lips. "An incident from a few years ago. Thinking about it, it was just this one incident, yet you still remember it to this day." Fan Xian raised his head and calmly said, "I am a very vengeful person. As you know, this matter has little to do with vengeance. As long as you don't stop, I will continue to do it without rest." There were no officials present or the crown prince present. Fan Xian and the second prince, a pair of young nobles with similar temperaments, spoke in a very direct and straightforward manner. They were both meticulous people and knew that there was no need for too many words to hide between them. The second prince glanced deeply at the third prince beside Fan Xian and suddenly said, "Sometimes I feel that life is not fair. Putting aside the Chui family and the Ming family matters, just in this palace, my beloved sister has married you as your wife, and my 2 brothers, who have been friendly with me since childhood, are now standing on your side." The second prince raised his head. There was a glimmer of hidden anger on his handsome face. "If my ability is not as good as yours, then so be it. However, this is only because of some absurd reasons and stories from a previous life that created the current situation. If Father was willing to give the Overwatch Council to me, would I do worse than you? If Father was willing to give the palace treasury to me, would I not have the ability to make the treasury more abundant? Neither you nor I know how to repair the dikes. And I can only pay silver. And G, don't you think this is very unfair? After all, I am the true prince." Fan Xian was silent for a long time. He knew that his strange and varied life in the Qing kingdom and the abnormal power he was able to obtain now were all because of that woman's legacy. Of course, that woman had also brought him countless troubles and dangers. What the second prince said was not completely without reason. If he and Fan Xian had switched places, he might not have done better. It was not that the second prince did not have the ability. It was that he had never had the stage to display his ability. He slowly said, "There is no such thing as if in this world." "Correct. That is why you now have the Overwatch Council in your left hand and the palace treasury in your right. the second prince said with slight mockery. Presumably, only your mother once had such great power. So, you are now beginning to be afraid. Fan Xian's expression froze again. The second prince calmly said, Have you thought about the future? Who exactly are you working hard for today? His gaze shifted slightly and glanced at the third prince. He smiled and said, None of the sons of the royal family are easy to deal with. You yourself are one of them. Of course, you understand this. The third prince lowered his head, not daring to interrupt. Fan Xian knew that the second prince was not speaking alarmist words. He just had his own plans and plans. The second prince faintly said, You are truly afraid. Think about it. Right now, you are walking down the path of a lonely official. Regardless of who ascends the throne in the future, how can the Qing kingdom tolerate you? How can the Overwatch Council be tolerated? Fan Xian listened calmly. The second prince continued, The reason you are afraid is because you are a smart person. You know that although your power is monstrous, it is only a floating cloud. It is not even as sturdy as a thin piece of paper. The second prince sighed, Because all the power in your hands was given to you by Father. With only one edict, you could be banished to the mortal world and never be able to rise again. Although Father dotes on you, it is not as if he did not guard against you. These years, he has allowed you to do whatever you want, but he will not let you touch the military. I think I do not need to remind you of the deeper meaning behind this. In the end, the second prince concluded, It is because you are afraid that you want to reduce your own power. The great prince drank a mouthful of wine and looked coldly at his two brothers talking like two fighting cocks. Fan Xian was silent for a long time and did not respond to the second prince's words. He only quietly said, Power has always been a floating cloud. When has there ever been an undefeated general or an undestroyed clan? Your Highness is a prince. Your heart is with the world, but I am only an official. I have to protect myself and the well-being of my clan. The second prince cut off his words and coldly said, I know that you, as a dignified immortal of poetry, have never been proud of the royal bloodline. On the contrary, you purposely avoided this point. Ask yourself honestly, if it were not for the royal bloodline that you loathe, how could you have lived until today and lived so gloriously? Two of the four brothers were silent. Two faced each other. Let go, the second prince said sincerely. The second prince said sincerely, Your power is actually all illusory. You don't dare to kill me, so you can only watch as each day passes while you are in greater danger each day. Since you have already sensed this, why don't you just let go more completely? Given your reputation in the world, you are one Er's husband, your father's son, you are an honored guest of Northern Qi. Who would make things difficult for you? Who would dare to take unnecessary risks to make things difficult for you? Ling has said that you love to travel the world. So why are you still limited to this dangerous Jingdo and unable to free yourself? Fan Xian's brows gradually furrowed. His fingers slowly gripped the wine cup and said, Your Highness, I said earlier, my thoughts are the same as yours. He raised his head. His expression brightened. Looking at the second prince, he calmly said, A year ago in the tea shop outside this brothel, if you don't let go, I will beat you until you let go. Reality has proven that the present me has this power. You can no longer see the 8 generals in the tea shop. This is sufficient proof. Hearing the words tea shop, the second prince's expression immediately froze. He thought of the conversation he had with Fan Xian in the tea shop outside Baiwa brothel a year ago in the autumn. At that time, the conversation had taken place between a prince and an official. After a year had passed, Fan Xian's power had expanded like a balloon. Most importantly, the two people's true identities had gradually become the same. Why should I let go? The second prince asked somewhat nervously and self-mockingly. Your Highness has been poisoned by the eldest princess. I will help you cure it. Fan Xian did not retreat. Coldly, he said, My words from before still stand. When your Highness maintains a distance from the eldest princess and truly lets go, I promise you a lifetime of peace. Based on what? The second prince looked seriously into Fan Xian's eyes. Just based on the Overwatch Council and silver? Fan Xian shook his head and said, Not based on what. It is just that I owe the imperial concubine a favor and want her a promise. Your Highness should know what happened tonight. I'm going to empty your Highness's personal power and beat you out of this pool of rotten water. Once the second prince thought of the great loss he had suffered tonight, he finally could no longer suppress the chill in his heart. Sinisterly, he said, "Why me? I am not father's only son. You too. I don't have a glimmer of ambition. I am just an official," Fancian said. "In another 2 days, your Highness will know my sincerity. As for the other princes, one is my student. I will beat him more obedient. The great prince likes to drink. I will ignore the crown prince, so I can only target you." You are right, this bloodline is worthy of some respect. So I will do everything I can to stop that terrifying thing from happening. The second prince's heart went cold. There was a gap in the screen that was not blocked properly. The winter wind began to drift slowly inside Balua Brothel. Fancian finally said, "Please remember this, your Highness. The Emperor is in his prime and does not wish to see such a thing happen." When Fancian and the Emperor spoke in the palace, the Emperor nodded. Perhaps no one noticed, but the storm in Jingdo was a controllable wave. Fancian used the opportunity of the Emperor's nod to cause a stir and take advantage of it. If one said that being stupid was a kind of attitude toward life, and pretending to be stupid was a kind of performance art, then being awesome was a kind of power that was backed by a mountain. Although Fancian's power was only a piece of paper, as long as the Emperor was in his prime, this paper could cut throats. The spring and autumn of the banquet at Hongmin had finally covered the topic. Originally, I was going to talk about political correctness, friendship, and progress in history, but I could not write it out. The problem of ability. There was still a storm outside the Balua house. Fancian had written 4 strokes, and inside the house, there were 2. I had to write more carefully and try to write better. Today, this chapter seems to have added too many words. It is over 1,000. I'm too lazy to fix it. Sorry, I will make it up tomorrow. If you want to know what happens next, please go to www.chijian.com. There are more chapters. I support the author and support the original reading. Chapter 464. The second prince left Balua Brothel. His expression was strangely cold. Regardless of what kind of information he had obtained in this conversation and what kind of trust and fear he had toward Fancian's purpose, the reality of tonight had already proven a lot. His power in the capital had already been mercilessly uprooted by Fancian. There were only 2 paths in front of him. One was to firmly rely on the eldest princess's side. The other was to do as Fancian thought and obediently withdraw from the battle for succession. Without power, what could he use to fight? The second prince knew that if the situation continued to develop like this, if Fancian did not sweep through his power tonight, then in the near future, the Qin kingdom would either sink into turmoil or he would be mercilessly purged. He would not feel a glimmer of gratitude toward Fancian because Fancian had forced him onto a dead end. After the great prince spoke a few words with Fancian, he also left Balua Brothel with a face full of worry. At the same time, he took the third prince with him. The conversation between the brothers in the royal family was not very pleasant. Since the third prince was returning to the palace, as the commander of the imperial army, it was appropriate for him to take him back. The night was gradually getting darker. If there were not thick snow clouds in the sky, one would certainly be able to see that the moon had moved to where it should be in the middle of the night. Fancian did not leave Balua Brothel. He sat alone for a long time and had the brothel prepare a bowl of lamb slices in clear soup. He ate it until his entire body was hot. He drank a few more cups of wine before slowly standing and walking to the window to look down. Outside the window was a deathly silence. The people of the Jingdo government and the garrison had all left. Balua Brothel was closed for the day. The girls had also gone to bed early. Only a few clever people were left to wait on him. Inside the brothel, red candles stood silently. Fancian had Si Ching prepare a bucket of hot water and took a comfortable bath. After the bath, he rubbed his slightly red face and asked, "Has the great prince gone to Yangsong Alley these 2 days?" Si Ching was listening from the side, and she knew that the big boss was talking about the Hu princess. She shook her head and prepared to help him put on his clothes, but he waved her away. Not long after, Sangwon came in. This gentle shopkeeper of the Baoyue brothel squatted down slightly and carefully put on his underwear. Her fingers slid across the surface of his well-proportioned muscles, and she couldn't help but be slightly startled. She didn't dare to move too much, and she carefully tied a hidden crossbow that was only 3 fingers wide to his left forearm. Putting on the boots and inserting the long and thin black crossbow head into the boots, Sangwon stood up and did the final tidying up of Fan Xian's clothing. She protected the black Overwatch Council robe and covered Fan Xian's skin that could be damaged by every drop of rain. Only then did she nod. Fan Xian smiled to show his appreciation. After confirming that he had not lost the pills, he patted Sangwon's head and walked out of the room. Sangwon was slightly startled. "Sir, sword?" Fan Xian turned his head and looked at the sword of the Wei Emperor in Sangwon's hand. His expression was calm, but a glimmer of confusion flashed through his eyes. A moment later, he said, "This sword is too bright. It's best not to take it. Let's leave it here for now." The triple leather curtains of the Baoyue brothel were lifted open. All of the managers respectfully saw Fan Xian out the door. He had already lifted the hood from the back of his robe and put on his head, letting the shadow cover his delicate features. Stepping down the stone steps outside the building, he couldn't resist raising his head to glance at the deep night. It was as if he wanted to confirm whether or not it would snow in a while. The carriage drove over. He shook his head, indicating that he was going to walk. He then headed east first. Baoyue brothel was having a banquet, so he did not bring the Tiger Guards. All of the Overwatch Council's power in Jingdo had already taken advantage of the night to carry out countless raids. Even the power of the Chinian unit had been thrown in. At this moment, there were only a few fan manor guards and a carriage driver at his side. Everyone knew about the Baoyue brothel's banquet and had heard about the commotion in Jingdo. They all thought that the young master was going to walk and think, so they didn't go forward to disturb him. They only had the carriage follow far behind. Not far after heading east, they turned and entered a straight street. Long street. Straight long street. Wearing a robe, he suddenly stopped his steps as if he was listening to something. He then waved his hand, indicating for the carriage behind him not to follow. He then walked toward the middle of the street. It was already deep into the night. A strange fog suddenly rose from the streets of Jingdo, which had stopped snowing. The fog was gradually heavier than the air. It gathered from all directions and gradually filled the long street. The slightly white fog was not very distinct on the lightless Jingdo night streets, but it effectively obstructed one's vision. It made one feel like they were blind and couldn't see their fingers in front of them. The carriage following behind did not dare let Fan Xian walk alone in the night. It was not prepared to listen to his arrangements, but it still had no choice but to stop. The fan manor guard in the carriage pulled out the infuriating lanterns a little brighter, but the dark yellow light only illuminated the fog in front. It was like the clouds above Song Mountain and could not see very far. They had long lost sight of the lonely figure in the black robe. On the long street, the white fog gradually thickened. Only the sound of Fan Xian's weak footsteps could be heard ringing out with a steady rhythm. Other than this, there was not a trace of sound. It was as if there were no living creatures on the street. Tonight, it seemed that the people the Overwatch Council wanted to kill had already been killed. The people they wanted to capture had already been captured and sent to prison, firmly under the 7th Bureau's control. The Jingdo people who still did not know about these things were greedy for warmth in their beds. The nobles on the night patrol had long returned home in fear. The night watchmen were slacking off, and the soldiers of the 13 city gate guards were only watching the city gates. The footsteps continued forward. They seemed to have sensed something and stopped in the white fog. A gust of winter wind blew past and thinned the fog on the long street slightly. One could faintly see the end of the long street. There shouldn't be anyone at the end of the long street, but it felt like someone was standing guard there. Wearing the robe, he stopped his steps and raised his head. His eyes calmly stared straight ahead. It was as if he wanted to see just who was there. Then he saw a person. The person's figure was tall and sturdy. His shoulders were like metal. He stood there like a mountain at the end of the long street. On his back was a longbow and a quiver. There were 13 arrows in the quiver. The wind stopped and the fog thickened. It was no longer visible. Tonight was the moment Fan Xian had the Overwatch Council launch an all-out attack on the Second Prince's faction. However, he seemed to have forgotten one thing. When your attack was at its fiercest, it was often when your defense was at its weakest. At this moment, there was no one at his side he could rely on, only himself. He was taking revenge for the attack in the valley, taking revenge without reason. He had forgotten that a certain governor was also taking revenge for the death of his only son. Could he dodge the bow in front of him? 2 years ago, he had been shot down for the palace walls by this bow and had no power to retaliate. That bow and arrow had already become the biggest blank space in his martial cultivation. Thus, he stopped his steps behind the fog. On the other side of the white fog, Yin Xiaoi lowered his eyes slightly and felt the aura of the person behind the fog to ensure that he would not break free of his control. There were no signs of movement on this side of the fog. Yin Xiaoi, the previous commander of the Imperial Army and now the Qin Kingdom's northern governor, was one of the few ninth-level super aces in the Qin Kingdom. He was not a madman. He knew what it meant to assassinate Fan Xian on Jingdo's Long Street. However, he still did not forcefully suppress his desire for battle and bloodlust. When he saw Yin Shindu's body in the Yuantai camp, he had already made up his mind. What was the purpose of one's life? Even if he controlled all the soldiers under heaven in the future and conquered this entire land, who would he entrust it to? Thus, he was not a madman, but he was already crazy. Jingdo was not calm tonight. No one had thought that Fan Xian would carry out such a tyrannical sweep. At the same time, no one had thought that the governor of the north would abandon all his worries and return to his original hunter's thoughts. Coldly, he observed Fan Xian, watched Fan Xian, waited for Fan Xian, and patiently waited for Fan Xian until he was dead. Although there was fog on Long Street that could block people's vision, it could not stop Yin Xiaoi's arrows. His arrows did not need eyes. Tonight, he had come with 13 arrows to ask Fan Xian what the words 13th Wong on the notice in the first bureau meant. If Fan Xian died, it was fine not to ask this question. Regardless of how much Fan Xian had improved these years, or how much of a genius he was in martial cultivation, Yin Xiaoi coldly believed that he could kill him. This matter had nothing to do with the fight for the throne or the world. It was not for justice or profit. It was just that a personal grudge could not be resolved. The two of them, one on the street and one in the middle of the street, other than facing each other head-on, there was nothing else they could do. Fan Xian was silent behind the fog. It was as if he was evaluating whether he should fight or retreat. After a long silence, Yin Xiaoi took a step forward. The murderous aura around his body caused the white fog in front of him to move, revealing an empty space in front of him. The air immediately became cold again. However, he immediately pulled his foot back. Glancing at the eaves to the upper left out of the corner of his eye, he furrowed his brows slightly and used the stone beast on the eaves to block his body. With his body and the stone beast as a line, he felt that at the end of that line, there was a strangely terrifying killing intent waiting for him. This was an unreasonable feeling. He had grown up in the woods and interacted with wild beasts. He had developed a sensitivity like a wild beast. He would always be able to judge the existence of danger ahead of time. The longbow was already in his hand, but the arrow had not been knocked. Yin Xiaoi lowered his head slightly and felt the strange movements around him, just who was lying in ambush. He was a powerful warrior above the 9th level. Other than those 4 strange creatures, there was not much in this world that Yin Xiaoi needed to be afraid of. Every time his condition reached its peak, the thought of challenging a great grandmaster would always rise in his heart. It was also because of his realm that he could clearly sense that there was only him and Fan Xian on Long Street. That was why he dared to use his mind to follow Fan Xian so coldly and prepare to fire a fatal arrow at any moment. However, when he had taken that step earlier, he had discovered a strange phenomenon. The first to bear the brunt was the unknown source of danger. The second was that when he had taken that step, he had felt the smell of the fog behind him change slightly. It was the smell, not the smell. It was the slightest change in the wind and fog, not the feeling after it entered his mouth. Yin Xiaoyi knew that there had always been a powerful figure hidden behind him. He didn't know exactly what realm this person's martial cultivation had reached, but to be able to fool him for so long, he must have the ability to hurt him. He didn't move rashly because he knew that once he fired the arrow, the energy he had stored up for a long time would leak out and reveal some flaws. Once his mind was flawed, he was not confident that he could escape unscathed under the combined attack of the ace behind him and the danger in the distance. Just like this, the long street was icy silent. The person on the other side of the fog could not move, and Yin Xiaoyi on the other side could not move either. He could not move his feet, but he could move his hands. Yin Xiaoyi sucked in a deep breath of air. His entire figure appeared to expand slightly. His fingers slowly fell, as if inadvertently brushing across his bowstring. His fingers were very thick, but this movement was very gentle. It was like a soft brush sweeping across a drawing paper, a slender finger brushing across the strings of a zither, or an orchid blooming slightly. With a light hum, the bowstring began to tremble. There seemed to be a strange magic being generated on his bowstring. The slightly trembling bowstring moved the air around it, twisting the faint white fog and gradually condensing into power. It sliced through the long street in front of him. Following this light hum, it silently attacked toward the other end of the fog. It attacked toward the person on the other end of the fog. A muffled grunt came from the other end of the fog. Immediately after, there was the sound of someone falling to the ground. Yin Xiaoyi calmly flipped his wrist. The longbow straightened. He didn't seem to move at all, but the arrow was already on the bowstring. Earlier, when he shot without an arrow, he already had such power. Now, he already had an arrow on his bowstring. However, he didn't fire. He only remained silent because he could clearly tell that the person on the other end of the fog was not Fan Xian. Although he was confused, he had clearly seen Fan Xian leave Baoyue Brothel. What did he switch? He understood that the roles of hunter and hunted had already changed in tonight's hunt. Yin Xiaoyi was stern and fearless. As long as the longbow was in his hand, even if 2 ninth-level aces came to ambush him, he would not feel any fear. On the contrary, he felt an excitement he hadn't felt in a long time. At any moment, he was ready to use the arrow on his bowstring to end a certain life. The arrow in his hand was not aimed, but his mind had already locked onto the distant place. However, the two sides were separated by the stone strange beast on the eaves of the residential buildings, so he was unable to fire. Yin Xiaoyi still had a portion of his energy on the smell of the fog behind him that had changed for an instant and had now returned to normal. No one would move first. After an indeterminable amount of time, the strange fog on Chong Street still did not dissipate. Yin Xiaoyi's mountain-like body continued to stand without a trace of exhaustion. However, he knew that the two people in the dark were also not tired. At least, they did not let him sense any relaxation in their state of mind. To be able to compete with him in patience and perseverance was a very impressive thing. Yin Xiaoyi acknowledged the other party's realm and strength. He understood that the attack on Chong Street in the middle of the night had already sunk into a stalemate. He had used the stone beast to protect himself, but it had also blocked him. If this stalemate continued, the sky would probably brighten and the two sides would still not be able to move. However, the other party could retreat, but Yin Xiaoyi could not move. He knew he had sunk into a disadvantage. Another long time passed. Yin Xiaoyi was still standing steadily in the corner of the street, like an unshakable statue. The longbow in his hand, the arrow on the string, was steady and motionless, giving off a very strange sense of beauty. Suddenly, a coughing sound came from Chong Street, shrouded in white fog. Accompanying this strange coughing sound, a faint light shone into the fog. The light gradually grew brighter. As it neared the corner of the street, as it got closer, it became clear that it was 2 lanterns. The lanterns were held by 2 young eunuchs. The The young eunuchs' faces were pale from the cold. Behind the young eunuchs was a small sedan carried by 4 servants. The coughing sound came from that small sedan. The sedan stopped next to Yin Xiaoi. The curtain of the sedan was lifted slightly, revealing an old and tired face. This face belonged to Eunuch Hong. Eunuch Hong's murky eyes blinked. He said quietly to Yin Xiaoi, who was next to the sedan, admiring the snowy night on the street, "Governor is in a good mood. However, it is already late. You should return to the manor. I will send you off." To be continued. If you want to know what happened next, please log on to www.chidian.com. More chapters. Support the author. Support genuine reading. Chapter 465. The sedan chair slowly left Chong Street. The warrior with the longbow also disappeared with it. All that was left on the empty ground was snow and white fog. Following the departure of the sedan chair, the coughing gradually weakened. The fog on Chong Street gradually dispersed. Although it was still dark all around, it appeared much clearer than before. Snowflakes quietly fell from the sky, swaying gently and gently, as if there was a deity high up in the sky, gently shaking a flowering tree. The clouds parted. A large crack suddenly appeared in the middle of the layers of dark clouds, revealing the crescent moon. The clear light gradually spread and illuminated this Chong Street clearly. The eaves of the stacked private residences behind the street that stretched into the middle of the street cast strange shadows on the ground because of the illumination of the moonlight. One of the black shadows suddenly trembled, twisting like some kind of living creature. Then it slowly and silently retreated, shrinking back into the large mass of shadows, no longer able to be separated from it. Fan Xian lay on the corner of a building in the distance. He was wearing a snowy robe with white interspersed between black and white. He withdrew his gaze from the corner of the street blocked by the stone beasts and gently sighed, blowing out a white mist in the dark night. The threads of ice on his eyebrows cracked and shattered. Tiredly, he faced the sky and stretched out the aching muscles all over his body. His eyes stared in a daze at the crescent moon in the night sky above his head. Touching the hard chest beside him, he unconsciously shook his head and narrowed his eyes. He had put in a lot of effort tonight and had prepared sufficiently. It looked like he was about to succeed, but Eunuch Hong had broken the plan. It was truly a failure. He had not prepared to use the chest. After all, this thing was too sensitive. Until the last moment, he could not use it lightly. However, if he wanted to kill Yin Xiaoi, a warrior who already stood at the peak of humanity, he did not have much confidence without his palm touching the hard chest. This was the support of his confidence and the last thing he could rely on. Fan Xian lay in the remaining snow on the roof and took a few deep breaths, calming his emotions of failure and the anger that came from nowhere. Someone crawled over. Fan Xian lifted the snowy robe and covered the object. A complicated emotion flashed through his eyes. Wang Qinian moved closer to his side and said, "It's Eunuch Hong." Fan Xian nodded. "Thank you for your hard work today." Tonight, everyone in the Overwatch Council was busy with bloody matters. Fan Xian's most trusted aide, Wang Qinian, appeared to have nothing to do. Only Fan Xian knew that the mission he had given him was for Wang Qinian to keep an eye on Yin Xiaoi's movements. He knew that Yin Xiaoi wouldn't miss this opportunity, so he didn't want to miss it either. Moreover, Wang Qinian's performance didn't disappoint him. An expert at level 9 didn't even notice that he was under Wang Qinian's watch. The two wings of the Overwatch Council, the most adept at tracking in the world, were indeed worthy of their reputation. Wang Qinian's face was very pale, even paler than the snow on the rooftop and the silver light in the street. Following Governor Yin was undoubtedly the most terrifying task in his life. That kind of fear and pressure made this 40-year-old middle-aged man almost unable to bear it, and his mind had long reached the point of collapse. And he didn't know if he saw something he shouldn't have. Fan Xian calmly said, "I trust you. More accurately speaking, many of my things are built on my trust in you." Wang Qinian understood what these words meant. Sir Fan Jr. had bumped into him when he first entered the capital. Then, with this as the center, he began to form the Chenian unit. Through the unit, he gradually controlled the Overwatch Council in his hands. Furthermore, he was, without question, the person in the world who knew the most of Sir Fan Jr.'s secrets, such as that night after reciting poems in front of the palace. That key. The next day, news came that there was an assassin in the palace. Wang Chenian knew who the assassin was. As for the key, it was certainly used to open something. Thus, Fan Xian still hadn't killed him to silence him. Wang Chenian was surprised and moved. He was truly moved. There was an urge in his heart to die for someone who understood him. This urge was clearly very dangerous and not worth it for him, who was over 40 years old, but he still kept this beautiful feeling in his heart. From below the gate came the cry of two owls. Fan Xian tilted his ear to listen. After confirming it was clean, he made a hand gesture to Wang Chenian beside him. A glimmer of fear flashed through Wang Chenian's eyes because he had also vaguely heard of that legend. He also knew of the connection between that legend and Sir Fan Jr.'s mother. He knew that, from now on, his life was completely in Sir Fan Jr.'s hands. This was the trust between them. This kind of trust in itself was a terrifying and life-threatening thing. He flipped his palm and slid down from below the gate. His sliding posture was very strange and comical. He was like a large praying mantis with long arms and legs, but he was silent. In a moment, he had reached the ground and walked to the center of the street. He crouched down and checked the aura of the person in disguise. After confirming that he was still alive, he made a hand gesture toward the air. This hand gesture was for Fan Xian to see. Fan Xian looked at this scene and couldn't help smiling. Lao Wang indeed had some skill. With this Qinggong, it was no wonder that the brocade guard hadn't been able to find anything to use against him after moving around in the north for a year. The person in disguise who had been injured by Yin Xiaoyi's flux was the substitute Fan Xian had brought with him at all times when he had gone to northern Qi. Back then, this substitute had helped him greatly. Today, he took it out to lure the enemy. A few more strange bird cries rang out from below the gate. A few secret agents wearing black robes arrived with the Fan Manor's carriage. They picked up Wang Chenian and the substitute. All of this appeared peaceful and natural. At this moment, the clouds in the sky gathered again. The clear light disappeared. Jingdo sank back into darkness. Before dawn, when it was the darkest, snowflakes began to fall again. Fan Xian came alone to a shop in the west of the city. All of the residences were still asleep. The shops had not begun to make preparations. Even the noodle stall that had opened the earliest had not begun to prepare the minced meat. Only the shop had already opened. It used the alluring bean fragrance inside to disperse the darkness before dawn and wait for the arrival of the morning sun. Under the snowflakes, Fan Xian sat at a small table outside the shop. He held a bowl of tofu pudding in his hand and slowly drank it. The taste of the tofu pudding was not bad. There was not much bean flavor. The fragrance wafted through the nose. It was even better than what Dong are made in Danzhou. This was a very natural reason. This tofu shop was the most famous in Jingdo. It was the first business the young master of Count Sinan's manor had set up after entering the capital. This tofu shop was Fan Xian's own. Fan Xian slowly drank the tofu pudding. His expression was calm, but he smiled bitterly in his heart. He had been reborn 20 years and truly was a useless second-generation ancestor. He had not brought much change to this world. The biggest change was probably the way he made tofu, right? His mother was too capable and too miraculous. In that short period of time, she had rushed to do everything that could be done. What was left for him to do? Was he going to be like all those powerful officials in history, playing with power and enjoying riches and honor, not thinking about the lives and deaths of those below him and living a muddled life? Just as he had thought about it before, worry gradually appeared on Fan Xian's face. He always felt that there was a great desire in the depths of his heart, but he still could not grasp what that desire was. He was annoyed and depressed. Thinking of the incident on the street and the longbow on Yin Xiaoyi's back, his mood dropped. F***CK. Fan Xian used a very soft voice and a very gentle attitude to curse. The fog tonight was actually not good. Although this was the environment the shadow had long determined, He had not thought that Yin Xiaoi's state of mind would be so powerful that he could not fear the layers of fog and accurately determine his position. Furthermore, the medicine hidden in the fog seemed to have no effect on this 9th-level ultimate ace. Once one's Jinshi had reached a certain depth, normal medicine was indeed not very useful. Fan Xian smiled self-mockingly. There was indeed no perfect thing in this world. The effect of the odorless white medicinal fog was indeed much weaker. Even so, in the murderous environment he had painstakingly created tonight, Fan Xian would still bravely try to kill Yin Xiaoi. He was not the emperor. His confidence came from his own strength and luck that was better than anyone else's. He was not as inexplicable as the emperor. Thus, he was used to being the first to strike and eliminating all powerful figures that could threaten him. Yin Xiaoi was the first person to bear the brunt. If there was great unrest in the Qin kingdom in the future, Fan Xian persisted. If he could weaken the other party's strength, it would be a wonderful thing for his side. Yin Xiaoi was not in the military. Instead, he was in the capital. Furthermore, he was the first to strike. This was the best opportunity. If he allowed the other party to return to the camp on the northern expedition, it would be a pipe dream to try to kill him. Thus, Fan Xian sat at the table feeling very defeated and angry. Why had old eunuch Hong come out to break the situation? Fan Xian's right hand holding the bowl trembled slightly. He furrowed his brows and threw the bowl in his hand to the ground. The porcelain bowl shattered into countless pieces. It was rare for him to have such an uncontrollable display of anger. From this, it could be seen that old eunuch Hong's sudden appearance had indeed made him extremely angry. Why? His brows were furrowed deeply. He still couldn't understand this point. It was clear that old eunuch Hong coming out of the palace to break the situation was either the emperor's or the empress dowager's. But what exactly were the mother and son, the most powerful people in the Qin kingdom, thinking? Did they still not see the present situation clearly? If he could kill Yin Xiaoi and had already cleaned out the second prince's power, the eldest princess's side would become increasingly weak. On the contrary, it would calm the situation of the entire royal family. Perhaps that terrifying ripple would gradually calm down. The emperor clearly knew this. Why did he nod his head and have eunuch Hong come out to stop his confrontation with Yin Xiaoi? Could it be that the emperor was a madman who liked to see his sister step by step on the path of rebellion? A masochist? Fan Xian thought angrily. A bitter smile rose to the corners of his lips. It looked like the royal family was truly a nest of perverts. They all thought the world was too boring. But was the emperor not afraid that he would be chased down from the throne? The repeated questions, the one that had troubled Fan Xian for a long time, made his expression become somewhat ugly. Huang Yi was the strategist of the Princess Manor. Although he hadn't caused any harm to Fan Xian and hadn't displayed any extraordinary abilities, since Fan Xian had acted, he had to eliminate all potential threats. Thus, Huang Yi was also a part of the plan tonight. Fan Xian didn't want to, in the future, have a melodramatic scene of hostages being captured because of his moment of soft-heartedness. It's not an expert at detoxification. Fan Xian shook his head. I understand the methods of the brothers in the Third Bureau. The Poison Master in Dongyi is not of the same faction as us. It looks like the eldest princess infiltration into the Overwatch Council back then was very effective. Other than the Deju Gu, she also prepared a number of detoxification pills. Yin Bingyun said, the spy buried in the Princess Manor hasn't been exposed. I acted on my own and had him withdraw. Very good. Fan Xian nodded his head approvingly. You make your own decisions on these matters. Don't let the people below take unnecessary risks. It's best if they can live. Although he said this, Fan Xian knew in his heart that this was the second failure of the night. Yin Bingyun opened his mouth again and said, the living witness you wanted to get a statement from is dead. Fan Xian raised his head and glanced at him. He knew he was talking about the only living witness in the Valley attack, the Qin family's private soldier. There had never been any clues or evidence in the Valley attack case. The only hope was that living witness. Furthermore, Since he was locked in the Overwatch Council's celestial prison and had the protection of the 7th and 3rd Bureau, it was impossible for him to die like this. He forcefully suppressed the strange emotion in his heart and glanced at Yin Bingyun with a not-quite-there smile. Strangely, he didn't fly into a rage. Just now, Eunuch Hong came. Fan Xian said to Yin Bingyun, "What do you think?" Yin Bingyun was slightly startled. A moment later, he quietly said, "First, the master feels that you crossed the line tonight. Second, regardless of whether he or you die, the master doesn't want to see it." "Don't talk about the master. I'll think of the old cripple's hateful tone," Fan Xian said with a furrowed brows. Yin Bingyun smiled and changed the subject. "Although the emperor has given his nod, you took the opportunity to make such a big deal out of it tonight. In tomorrow's court conference, the council will certainly be attacked by a group of officials. I'm afraid that Shu the scholar and Hu the scholar will both speak. Under this kind of pressure, the emperor will have a certain attitude. You'd better be prepared." "What are you afraid of?" Fan Xian glanced at Sir Yin Jr.'s pale face and said self-mockingly, "The emperor has long wanted to reduce the Overwatch Council's power. Didn't this give him a good opportunity? If I didn't know this, I wouldn't have rushed to attack everywhere tonight. Before reducing power, I have to wipe out some of the enemies." With a clang, he threw the spoon into the slightly cold porcelain bowl. His face was like frost. "Tonight, I didn't do a single thing I truly wanted to do. What a great loss." Yin Bingyun said, "In a few hours, it will be the court conference. You have to go to court to report on your work. Prepare to be demoted by the emperor." Fan Xian closed his eyes and slowly said, "A few days ago, the emperor had you young officials enter the palace. His intentions were clear. However, how could those old people be willing to give up their positions? Tonight, the Overwatch Council conducted a large-scale investigation. Even if we will be punished afterward, some of those unclean people will have to step down. The court will have to make some space so that the emperor can place people in. We are working for the emperor, so he will have to owe us a favor." Yin Bingyun furrowed his brows slightly. It was still difficult for him to get used to Fan Xian calling the emperor like this. He was also displeased, so he could only maintain a suitable silence. Fan Xian couldn't be bothered to look at his expression. Minding his own business, he quietly said, "Tonight's matter is pretty much over. I just feel a bit regretful that the family I've been waiting for still hasn't made a move." Yin Bingyun knew which family he was talking about, but he pretended not to know. For a moment, his expression was hesitant. Shortly after, he smiled bitterly and said, "Do you think it's not lively enough? You don't have anyone by your side right now. You have to be careful of your safety." Fan Xian glanced at the Overwatch Council swordsmen scattered around and shook his head. "I'm different from you. You have to bring these people. As for me, whether I bring them or not, it doesn't make much of a difference. If I brought people, how could those people dare to make a move? They're all a group of cowards who only know how to kill people in the dark," Fan Xian said mockingly. "I've been sitting alone in this shop for an hour, but no one has come. It makes me look down on the so-called Iron Blood Army." Yin Bingyun shook his head and was speechless. Fan Xian turned his head and glanced at a small alley in the darkness. Using his finger to knock on the table beside the tofu bowl, he said, "Eat it. It doesn't taste good when it's cold." In a small alley some distance from Fan's tofu shop, there were 7 people dressed in black moving corpses onto carriages. Blood slowly dripped down from the carriages and landed on the snow, giving off a faint stench. The 3 corpses had been chopped into a dozen large pieces of meat. It was clearly the terrifying damage caused by a long knife. The leader of the 7 night walkers sat in the driver's seat. Glancing at the faint light of the tofu shop in the distance, he used the reins to rub the slightly itchy calluses between his thumb and forefinger. Opening his mouth into a smile, he said in a quiet voice, "Young master, eat slowly." To be continued. If you want to know what happened afterwards, please log on to www.chidian.com. More chapters. Support the author. Support original reading. Chapter 466. Early in the morning, Fan Xian returned to his manor and changed his clothes. After giving a few orders, he sat in the carriage outside the royal palace. By the time he arrived, the area by the palace doors was already unusually lively. Officials were gathered in groups of 2 or 3 and whispering about something. He lifted the curtain to take a look and couldn't help but shake his head. It looked like last night's story had already become today's gossip. He was the center of the officials' discussion. He had not slept all night and had been tossed about so many things. It was inevitable that his spirit was fatigued. He accepted a towel soaked in ice water from Tang Zijing's hand and rubbed it hard on his face. The skin on his face hurt, as if it had been pierced by needles. His spirit finally woke up a little. He yawned, stretched, and exhaled a few mouthfuls of murky air before getting out of the carriage. As he walked along the bricks of the square in front of the palace, he attracted countless gazes and discussions. Everyone was looking at the commissioner of the Overwatch Council dressed in official robes. This was Fan Xian's first court meeting since becoming the Jiangnan Road Imperial Envoy. Logically speaking, the officials in front of the palace should have come forward to exchange pleasantries and greetings. For some reason, the officials' eyes were filled with wariness. They only watched from a distance and did not come closer. In reality, the reason was simple. Last night, the Overwatch Council had killed and arrested people. Although the people they arrested were all low-ranking officials, there were too many people. No one knew how many court officials were involved. Although these officials were shocked, they were immediately surrounded by anger. In today's court meeting, they were certain to report Fan Xian. Since it was so, it was not good for them to come forward and greet him. Fan Xian left in a bad mood. He felt that he was about to become a lonely official who was spurned by the civil and military officials of the court. Although this was his own doing, this feeling of being ignored was like being boycotted by little girls in kindergarten. He was filled with grievance. His face did not show it. He continued to smile calmly and warmly, as if he did not feel the fiery gazes. When he walked to the palace doors, the guards and eunuchs guarding the doors greeted him. Fan Xian looked at the 2 eunuchs' ingratiating gazes and felt his heart warm and comforted. He thought to himself that in this world, it was indeed the handicapped who were more caring. Tilting his head, he saw that the 2 leaders of the civil officials were pointing their noses at the sky, as if they were observing the sky to see if there was anything unusual. Fan Xian rubbed his nose. He was familiar with the white-bearded old man on the left. He also knew that the middle-aged man on the right was certainly the initiator of the literary reform movement, Hu the Scholar. Seeing these 2 overseers of the Hall of Governmental Affairs treat him so coldly, Fan Xian knew that he had made too much of a ruckus last night. In the eyes of these people, he was already leaning toward becoming a powerful and treacherous official. Additionally, the Overwatch Council's abnormal actions had indeed created a bad influence on court politics. These 2 leaders of the civil officials would not be too close to him, the head of the Secret Service. But he didn't buy it. Forcefully suppressing the resentment in his heart, he moved closer with a mischievous smile on his face and stood next to the scholars Shu and Hu. He didn't say anything and instead raised his head to look at the sky in a strange manner. For a moment, the officials waiting to go into court saw a strange sight. The 2 scholars, as well as the wretched commissioner of the Overwatch Council, all had their necks straight and heads tilted up. They looked endlessly at the layers of black clouds in the sky, but did not say anything. They were only silent. After looking for an indeterminable amount of time, it was finally the easygoing Shu the Scholar who couldn't bear it anymore. With a cold huff, he said, "What is Sir Fan Jr. looking at?" Shu the Scholar also pulled back his gaze from the sky. Although the 2 scholars were clever people, they were not as thick-skinned as Fan Xian. They could not endure too many people's strange gazes. He coughed and didn't say anything. Fan Xian smiled and said, "Whatever you 2 are looking at, I am looking at." Shu Wu furrowed his brows and looked at him, wanting to say something but then hesitating. After enduring for a moment, he still couldn't hold back the anger in his heart. He opened his mouth to reprimand. "Do you know that because the Overwatch Council has power, it has to act carefully and safely?" Putting aside what your intentions are, just driving around Jingdo like a tiger or a wolf, how will the officials behave? How will the court act? You don't want the face of the world's gentry, but the court wants it. Tell me, you've captured so many yamen of the 6 ministries. How will they act? Putting aside how to act, the officials' hearts are all cold. How foolish. How foolish. It was fine if he didn't say it, but once he did, he couldn't stop. On the contrary, it was the scholar who gave Shu Wu a meaningful glance. Only then did Shu Wu stop. However, he still felt bitter and hateful. He couldn't control his anger. Presently, Fan Xian was no longer just a teacher in the Imperial College. He was also no longer an empty prince consort who could only roll around in Honglu Temple. Although the rank of the commissioner of the Overwatch Council was not high, he was, after all, an imperial envoy. Although Shu the scholar was now the head of the civil officials, it was still inexcusable for him to scold an imperial envoy so haughtily. "Stop scolding," Fan Xian said with a smile. Fan Xian laughed and said, "No matter what, you are still an elder. To be so fierce to my nephew, it does not look good to the officials below." Shu Wu was furious, but he couldn't scold Fan Xian's tired but respectful face. He huffed hatefully and swept his sleeve. "In the court conference today, just wait for me to report you." Fan Xian's face was bitter. He raised his hands in greeting and said, "As expected, Elder, please take care of me." Shu Wu was angry, and also wanted to laugh. Coincidentally, the palace doors opened. With the crack of a whip, ceremonial music began to play. He and the scholar walked in first. It is a court conference. There were many more officials in court than usual. Even so, given Fan Xian's official rank, it was still not enough for him to line up in court. However, he now had the identity of Jiangnan Road Imperial Envoy and was going to the palace to report on his work, so he did not need the Emperor's special edict. However, entering the palace also needed to be lined up, so Fan Xian could only be at the back. As he stood at the palace gate, a cold and sinister aura seeped out, making the officials who walked past him feel a chill. Earlier, when there were a lot of people, they could still tie together and ignore Fan Xian. Now, they were walking into the palace in pairs. The officials estimated that their status was far from Shu the scholar's. They calculated the Emperor's favor Fan Xian carried and thought of Fan Xian's methods. They had no other choice. They could only quietly greet him each time they passed him. Toward Sir Fan Jr., whom they had not seen in a year, these officials did not dare to be too disrespectful. "Sir Fan Jr., I trust you have been well. Greetings, Commissioner Fan." Fan Xian smiled and responded to each of them. Although he knew that he would lose face because of these people in the court conference, the vanity of being bowed in order by the officials at the palace doors was not bad. He had to make the best use of this time to gain some benefits in terms of face. He had gained the benefits in terms of face, but what he got in the palace was only sour fruit. Fan Xian stood at the very back of the line and secretly sized up the Emperor on the dragon chair with a slanted glance. A wave of tiredness surged through him. Looking at the Emperor's calm and spirited expression, he felt a bellyful of anger. He thought to himself, "You sleep peacefully, but I'm about to die of exhaustion from doing things for you." Just as everyone had expected, once the court conference began, before everything had been properly arranged and the governors of the 3 roads standing below Shu and the scholars had time to present memorials, the battle of memorials targeting Fan Xian and the Overwatch Council's actions last night suddenly began. Fan Xian did not listen to the specific contents of the memorials. It was nothing more than the old words Shu Wu had once said. The Overwatch Council did indeed have the duty of supervising the governance of officials, but it had been many years since an action like his, where he had captured over 30 officials in one night, had taken place. It could truly be said to have shaken the court. He looked at the governors of the 3 roads and was not surprised to see Xue Qing at the top. The Qing kingdom's territory was large, and there were 4 governors in remote areas who returned to the capital every 2 years. He wondered with some curiosity. Last night, Xue Qing had been watching by imperial edict in Baiwa brothel. Logically speaking, He should have entered the palace that night to report to the emperor. He wondered what the emperor thought of him. Fan Xian was truly tired, so his mind wandered completely. However, there were many things he could not hear, even if he did not want to hear. The attacking words of the entire court continued to surge endlessly into his ears. Gradually, the crimes began to grow, such as looking down on the court, disrespecting morals, using national weapons for private purposes, forming a clique, and so on. In the Qing court, the Overwatch Council and the system of civil officials had always been sworn enemies. Regardless of what faction the civil officials had, when faced with the Overwatch Council, they were always united. From when Prime Minister Lin was there to now, when the scholars were at the head, as long as the Overwatch Council, the Emperor's secret organization, overstepped its bounds, the system of civil officials would band together and carry out the most powerful counterattack. Without question, Fan Xian had overstepped his bounds last night. Thus, today's court conference became the battlefield where he was attacked. What was different from previous years was that the military, which had always had a close relationship with the Overwatch Council, no longer maintained its silence. On the contrary, the two deputies of the Bureau of Military Affairs also stood out and secretly expressed their dissatisfaction with the Overwatch Council's actions. Even the Emperor himself probably did not want to endure this kind of pressure, much less Fan Xian, who stood alone at the end of the line. The atmosphere in Taiji Palace was no longer oppressive. On the contrary, it was filled with a kind of irritation unique to winter. With Xu Wu in the lead, the officials all went up to ask the Emperor to restrain the Overwatch Council, and at the same time, make a final judgment on this matter. One after another, their words pierced straight into Fan Xian's heart and wounded his spirit. Slanderous water flew in all directions. If it had been any other official in Fan Xian's position, they would probably have long lost their minds in anger and jumped out to debate with the officials. At the same time, they would gather their remaining courage and pull out the beards of the imperial censors. However, Fan Xian still forcefully maintained his calm. He didn't say a word or defend himself. He only tilted the corners of his lips slightly, carrying a glimmer of a mocking smile as he watched the stage of the court conference. Perhaps it was the smile at the corners of his lips that made someone uncomfortable to look at. It made someone feel that his son was too impetuous and arrogant. An angry rebuke came from the dragon chair. Fan Xian, do you have nothing to say? Fan Xian had been forcefully pushing away his drowsiness. Suddenly hearing these words, he shivered. Tidying his official robes, he stepped out and bowed. Your Majesty, last night, the First Bureau of the Overwatch Council summoned 32 officials for questioning. Everything was done according to Qing law and edict. There was nothing that went beyond the rules. Thus, I do not understand why everyone is so agitated. The Emperor smiled coldly and said, You captured 32 people in one night. You sure are arrogant. Is the Qing court full of corrupt officials? Fan Xian said seriously, I dare not deceive your Majesty. In court, he gazed at the officials in the palace and said seriously, Vermin crawl all over the ground. 32 people is only a small number. If your Majesty grants the Overwatch Council a special edict, I will certainly be able to capture more corrupt officials. The officials' hearts chilled. Immediately, disdain rose to their faces. They thought to themselves, what are you talking about? What is the court? The court is the officials. There are no officials in this world who are not corrupt. If you capture them all, who will govern the world on behalf of the Emperor and protect the people? How could the Emperor give you a special edict? As expected, the Emperor flew into a rage and gave Fan Xian a thorough scolding. It was nothing more than not seeing the big picture, acting recklessly, and sullying the Emperor's heart. Fan Xian was unhappy. Although he knew it was an act, he was still unhappy. He resentfully returned to the ranks. In the court conference, no one brought up the death of the second prince's 8 family generals, the death of Governor Yan's only son, and the eldest princess strategist Huang, each being poisoned and vomiting blood in bed. Those people were not officials. Furthermore, it was a matter of the dark. No one would be so stupid. However, Just the events of last night were enough to arouse the wariness and anger of the civil and military officials. Thus, even the emperor had to appease them. However, the emperor sitting on the dragon chair only coldly said, concerning the assassination attempt on Fan Xian in the outskirts of the capital, "How is the investigation going?" The officials were silent. The official of the Supreme Court and the Minister of Justice stepped out with trembling bodies and repeatedly begged for forgiveness. Fan Xian had no choice but to step out and beg for forgiveness. After all, the Overwatch Council was part of the Joint Investigation Division. However, this matter was absurd. He had been assassinated, but he had not found out, yet he had to beg for forgiveness. The emperor looked at Fan Xian and furrowed his brows. "I heard that the last witness died in the celestial prison last night. Is this true?" Fan Xian was stunned. He had not thought that the emperor's news would come so quickly. On the other side, the faces of the Wu officials revealed a deeply hidden joy and smile. They were waiting to see how Fan Xian would explain this matter. The emperor did not need too much explanation. All of the preparation work had already been done. The emperor was decisive. He issued the edict he had been preparing for a few days. The first part of the edict made all the civil and military officials feel a sense of disbelief, because the emperor had reduced the power of the Overwatch Council. The Overwatch Council's rank did not drop, but its power was greatly restricted, particularly the first bureau stationed in Jingdao. Although it still had the power to arrest people, it had made detailed rules on the time limit after an arrest. In particular, the transfer of prisoners to and from the Supreme Court had to be completed within 48 hours. In other words, the First Bureau no longer had the power to secretly interrogate officials in the capital. At the same time, the edict made a general limit on the power of the Fourth Bureau stationed in each province. As for the specific rules, Fan Xian would have to return to the council to draw up a draft and then submit it to the court for discussion. These two changes appeared small, but in reality, it was like a timer had been placed on the Overwatch Council. It made it inconvenient for them to do things in the future. Fan Xian listened to the edict. He felt disgusted, like he had eaten a fly, but he still had to step out and give thanks. The civil and military officials were pleasantly surprised. At most, they had wanted the emperor to issue an edict to demote Fan Xian and, at the same time, slightly restrain the Overwatch Council and give the subordinates who had been innocently arrested a chance to live. They had not expected that the emperor would actually take action against the Overwatch Council. If this trend continued, the Overwatch Council's power would gradually be whittled away. Thus, cries of "Long live the emperor" filled Taiji Palace. The officials secretly thought that the emperor was indeed wise. However, the second part of the emperor's edict made the civil and military officials feel that although the emperor was wise, he was still too protective of his own people. The edict made it clear that the officials who had been arrested last night were not limited by the previous rules. They would all be handed over to the Overwatch Council to interrogate and then handed over to the Supreme Court to convict and interrogate. At the same time, the emperor used this matter to fly into a rage. He angrily rebuked the officials in the palace for not being strict with their subordinates and letting down the grace of the country. They only knew how to form cliques for personal gain and were shameless. Once the edict came down, the officials were terrified and didn't know what to do. Because the investigation of the attack in the valley was not done well, the Jingdao guards were treated as empty. In the case of corruption among the officials in the capital, the right deputy of the Bureau of Military Affairs, Chu Xiangdong, was demoted. The commander of the Jingdao garrison, Qin Heng, was removed and replaced by the deputy general of the Western Expedition Army. Qin Heng was transferred into the Bureau of Military Affairs. At the same time, the assistant minister of the Ministry of Justice was replaced, the deputy of the Supreme Court was replaced, and the imperial censor writing in the imperial censor was replaced. The replacements were all the young officials who had entered the palace a few days ago. The officials paled in shock. The emperor's lightning-fast methods truly caught everyone off guard. If it weren't for the recent conflicts in Jingdao, such a large-scale change of blood would not have proceeded so smoothly. Everyone knew that the matter was not over yet. They couldn't resist sneaking a glance at the young man at the back of the line. A complicated emotion welled up in their hearts. Only now did they understand that Sir Fan Jr.'s sinister actions last night were just foreshadowing the edict in today's court conference. It has been very busy recently. The timing of the updates has been a bit unstable. I will report to everyone in the future. I wish everyone a happy weekend. If you want to know what happens next, please log on to www.chijian.com. There are more chapters. Support the author. Support the original reading. Chapter 467. Once the edict came down, the officials were in an uproar. Although the leaders of the various departments had not changed positions, there were more young officials at their side. They couldn't help but feel a glimmer of fear. Who knew when the emperor would raise up those young officials to replace them? These old people. Shu the scholar furrowed his brows and stepped out. He argued with the emperor for a bit. He felt that such a large-scale appointment of officials without going through court deliberations or having the Ministry of Appointments and Overwatch Council examine it first was truly too rushed. However, the emperor had made up his mind and did not even give him face. He lightly refuted it. This imperial edict became a matter that was set in stone. A change of blood was already inevitable. Qin Hung had been moved to the Bureau of Military Affairs. His rank appeared to have increased, but in reality, he had left the vital area of the Jingdo garrison. He was somewhat stunned, but he could only step out and thank the emperor. Other important figures like the previous deputy of the Bureau of Military Affairs, Chu Xiangdong, could only helplessly accept this suggestion. The emperor did not look deeply into the matter of the attack in the valley. Otherwise, the military would certainly have to pay a greater price. However, the gazes with which the military generals looked at Fan Xian became increasingly angry. Everyone knew that among the civil and military factions, the emperor had adjusted the Bureau of Military Affairs and the Jingdo garrison to support Fan Xian and vent his anger for the attack in the valley. As for what other follow-up actions there would be after the court was dismissed, they would have to wait quietly. However, the military's days were not going to be easy. Among the civil officials, the largest number of officials had been replaced. Basically, they were all officials close to the Second Prince's faction. What was particularly terrifying was that it seemed that the 32 officials Fan Xian had captured last night would not have a chance to come out again. Fan Xian listened carefully to the edict. It was clear that the emperor had prepared this edict last night. After listening for a long time, he was surprised that he did not hear Yin Bingyun's name. However, thinking about it, it made sense. Even if the emperor wanted to put Yin Bingyun in an important position, he would not move him to another department. Putting aside the fact that this was against Qing law and the Overwatch Council's rules, if the emperor wanted to use Yin Bingyun, he would have to give Qin Pingping some face. As for Sir Yin Jr. being promoted, it was also impossible. If he was promoted again, he could only take Fan Xian's commissioner position. Fan Xian shook his head and thought to himself that unless the emperor was prepared to single-handedly flip the Overwatch Council over, he would not do such a thing. But Fan Xian was surprised to hear Cheng Zhaolin's name. He tilted his head slightly and resisted the urge to look at the middle-aged man on the dragon chair. A strange feeling welled up in his heart. Zhao Lin was a student and was now an official far away in a foreign land. How had he fallen into the emperor's eyes? And to the Ministry of Personnel? The department that he had been unable to interfere with had been promoted twice in one go. This kind of promotion speed was too fast. When the officials of the court heard Cheng Zhaolin's name, they couldn't help but be shocked. Everyone knew that he was one of Fan Xian's 4 disciples. He had only been an official for 2 years. Why was he being transferred back to Jingdo? Everyone turned their gazes toward Fan Xian, their gazes filled with caution and fear. Fan Xian felt a bit uncomfortable. The favor the emperor had given him was too great. According to his habits, after giving a sweet date, there would be a stick. He didn't know where the stick would land. Shen Chongwen has been transferred to the Imperial Censorate to be an Imperial Censor. He has ordered the Imperial Censor of the Left, He Zhongwei, to oversee Overwatch Council matters and assist Fan Xian in his actions. He is responsible to the internal court. The stick came really fast. Fan Xian abruptly raised his head. A dim light flashed through his eyes as he glanced at the young man who had stepped out to give thanks. The Imperial Censor of the left had entered the manor. Although the Overwatch Council had always been under the supervision of the internal court in name, the Qing royal family had always strictly prohibited eunuchs from holding power. Additionally, Chun Pingping was too powerful, so the Overwatch Council was like an independent kingdom. To have the Imperial Censor of the left keep an eye on the Overwatch Council and report to the internal court at the same time was putting the Overwatch Council directly under the gaze of the royal palace. Fan Xian's back felt a chill. The fingers on his right hand trembled slightly. He knew that, because of his identity, the emperor would not trust him as much as he trusted Chun Pingping. However, he had not thought that the emperor would act so ruthlessly. Before the matter had even concluded, he had already put a rope around his head and pricked it until it hurt. Who was he Zonwei? He was a Jingdo talent who had once been as famous as his student, Ho Ji-chong. He was one of his sister Ruo's pursuers. He had first been under the crown prince and then the eldest princess. Now, he had become the emperor's student. Without going through the imperial examinations, he was directly selected into the court as an imperial censor. Because of his meritorious service, he had become the imperial censor of the left and was responsible for investigating the Ministry of Revenue case. Not including Fan Xian, He Zonwei was definitely the most popular figure in the Qing court these 2 years. Yet such a disgusting person like Fan Xian was going to become the emperor's eyes watching the Overwatch Council. Fan Xian grew angry for no reason. He was unusually angry. "Your Majesty." Fan Xian stepped out of the ranks and stood by He Zonwei's side. Facing the man on the dragon chair, he said in a low voice, "I have an objection." He Zonwei glanced warmly at Fan Xian beside him. Although each time he thought of being beaten by the other party in Fan Manor, he felt an incomparable anger in the depths of his heart. He still hid it well. His eyes revealed just the right amount of strangeness and admiration. It was as if he was expressing his emotions to the officials in the palace. He admired Sir Fan Jr. for daring to talk back to the emperor. The palace was already in an uproar. The emperor had an order, and the officials had to accept it. Other than old people like Xu Wu, who dared to talk back to the emperor, no one had ever directly expressed their objection and resentment on the appointment of an official. The emperor furrowed his brows and said, "What objection do you have?" Fan Xian raised his head and said expressionlessly, "The Overwatch Council does not need an imperial censor to point fingers." "How dare you?" The emperor slapped the dragon chair and said angrily, "The law enforcement is at the side, and the imperial censor is at the back. The laws of the country are clear. My decision has been made. How can I allow you to speak so much?" Anger rose in Fan Xian's heart. He knew he could not retreat anymore. Otherwise, if the Overwatch Council really fell at his hands, how would he explain it to that woman and the old cripple in Qingarten? He straightened his body and straightforwardly said, "May I ask, Your Majesty, the Overwatch Council is responsible for supervising the governance of officials. It is overseen by the internal court, the Overwatch Council. Suddenly, there is an imperial censor. If this imperial censor is corrupt and breaks the law, should the council investigate or not? If we were to investigate, how?" The officials clamored. On the contrary, the emperor laughed coldly and said, "You have been clever your whole life, yet you are pretending to be confused. Go back." At Fan Xian's side, He Zonwei also insincerely tried to persuade him, but Fan Xian couldn't even be bothered to look him in the eye. He also didn't retreat. His eyes spun a few times and suddenly said in a loud voice, "I object." This was a bit over the line. When the emperor decided on something, how could he, an official, object? This was not a lawsuit in court. "Fan Xian, you are not Song Shuren, and the emperor is not a little prefectural magistrate." The emperor's anger was not kind. The beard on his chin trembled wildly. Pointing down at Fan Xian's nose, he scolded, "I want to see how you object." Fan Xian steeled his heart and said, "Naturally, I do not dare to object. However, I am only the commissioner of the Overwatch Council. The director is still in Qingarden. Logically speaking, it is not my place to discuss this edict. However, I am the head of the Overwatch Council today. Whether I accept it or not is also a problem. It looks like I can only resign as commissioner of the Overwatch Council. Your Majesty, directly send an edict to the Overwatch Council. Resign as commissioner of the Overwatch Council? Resign? The officials were in an uproar. They had no idea how the court conference had developed into such a situation. They had thought that the Emperor was using the Overwatch Council to clean up the court. How come, in the end, he was bullying Sir Fan Jr.? However, Sir Fan Jr. was indeed worthy of being an immortal poet. The pride in his bones was indeed not something normal people could compare to. He dared to use resignation as a threat in the court conference to not accept the edict. Since the founding of the Qin Kingdom, these officials had never seen such daring. For a moment, the sound of discussion rose in the palace. Other than the initial fear in their gazes toward Fan Xian, who was standing in the center, they couldn't help but have a glimmer of absurdity and admiration. Shu the scholar and Hu the scholar could not continue watching. They both stepped out, one playing the bad cop and the other playing the good cop. Shu the scholar scolded Fan Xian, saying that he did not know his duty as an official and spoke nonsense. Hu the scholar stood by Fan Xian's side and comforted him, explaining the Emperor's edict in detail. In any case, Fan Xian just stood straight and refused to accept the edict. He also refused to do anything. This scene looked like a kindergarten student who had lost fruit on his lunch plate and was being tricked by two teachers. Shu and Hu the scholars then turned to beg for forgiveness on Fan Xian's behalf, saying how Sir Fan Jr. was young and so on. They guessed that it was rare for the Emperor to encounter such a big nail in court. He was probably about to go crazy with anger. On the dragon chair, the Emperor laughed angrily. A cold light shone in his eyes. Coldly, he said, Fan Xian, are you going to use resignation to threaten me? I don't dare. Good, good, good. The Emperor said good 3 times in a row. Faintly, he said, You think I won't punish you just because I love you? If you want to resign, then The Emperor had not finished speaking when Fan Xian was moved and thanked him. Thank you, Your Majesty. I am willing to go back to the Imperial College to teach. The Emperor choked on his quick response and said angrily, I will not let you resign. For a moment, the palace sank into a shocked silence. No one had thought that they would be able to see such an exciting show at the court conference. Everyone knew that the Emperor's favor toward Fan Xian had not decreased at all. He probably would not give Fan Xian any substantial punishment. However, they didn't know how this stalemate could be broken. The officials did not understand why Fan Xian would be so angry and impulsive toward the Imperial Censorate asking about the Overwatch Council. If it was to maintain the Overwatch Council's power, given Fan Xian's methods, he had plenty of ways to do so in the future. Furthermore, the Overwatch Council still had an ancestor that had not made an appearance. It was clear that the Emperor also did not know what Fan Xian was thinking. He furrowed his brows and said to Fan Xian, Get over here. Fan Xian did not get out. He ran over with a jolt and moved closer to the dragon chair. His face was full of stubbornness and ruthlessness. The Emperor lowered his voice and asked, Are you going to accept the edict or not? No. The Emperor furrowed his brows and said why. Fan Xian said straightforwardly, I don't like his own way. The Emperor angrily said, Last night, you already made the court lose face. Do you want me to lose face again today? Get back here. Fan Xian sighed and retreated. Eunuch Yao stood to the side with a pained expression. Holding his horsetail whisk, he suppressed a smile. It was very uncomfortable. Fan Xian retreated into the palace. The officials on both sides looked at him with strange gazes. He was actually whispering to the Emperor in court. This favor was truly cough-cough. The Emperor did not give Fan Xian any chance to speak. He also did not care if he accepted the edict or not. He directly nodded his head to Eunuch Yao. Eunuch Yao immediately used a duck's voice that was different from Eunuch Dai's and called out, Jiangnan Road Plenipotentiary Imperial Envoy Fan Xian, come forward to hear the edict. Fan Xian paused. He lifted the front of his robe and knelt down. The edict spoke slowly. It did not mention the matter of the Imperial Censorate entering the Overwatch Council. Instead, it gave a general list of what Fan Xian had done this year in Jiangnan, placing particular emphasis on the matter of the Palace Treasury Transport Company. It praised Fan Xian's contributions to the national treasury and also mentioned the matter of Fan Xian helping Governor Xue Qing investigate the governance of Jiangnan officials. The emperor opened his mouth and said, "I think that Sir Fan Xian is loyal to the country and should be heavily rewarded." The officials were silent. Although no one liked Fan Xian receiving another reward, the over 10 million liang of silver the palace treasury had shipped back to Jingdo was real. Such a large and solid contribution was worthy of an enemy's contribution. If it was not heavily rewarded, the court did not know how to explain it to the people of the world. Xue Qing stepped out and added to Fan Xian's Jiangnan affairs. He was full of praise. Scholar who stepped out and also thought that Sir Fan Jr. should be heavily rewarded. Xu Wu's eyes spun a few times and then glanced at Fan Xian. Finally, he couldn't resist stepping out and saying, "Your Majesty, half a year ago, the Hall of Governmental Affairs had a discussion. Given Sir Fan Jr.'s reputation, knowledge, and achievements, it was truly enough for him to enter the Hall of Governmental Affairs to discuss matters. However, Overwatch Council officials are never allowed to become court officials. The court had set the precedent. However, earlier, Sir Fan Jr. had intended to resign as commissioner of the Overwatch Council." The emperor coughed. Who the scholar also couldn't resist glancing at Xu Wu with a strange gaze, thinking that this old man was indeed stubborn. He clearly knew that the emperor would not allow Fan Xian to enter the pavilion, much less allow Fan Xian to leave the Overwatch Council. Yet, he still held on to the idea the two of them had half a year ago. However, Xu Wu had already spoken, so he could only express the same wish and recommend Fan Xian to enter the pavilion. Fan Xian had heard of this matter in the council reports, but seeing it with his own eyes, he couldn't help feeling surprised. He was not even 20 years old, yet he wanted to enter the pavilion. This was a bit too absurd. As expected, the emperor still did not allow it. He only had eunuch Yao finish announcing the edict. After listening to the edict, Fan Xian froze where he was. A moment later, he remembered to give thanks. He thought that it was indeed absurd for him to be a scholar, but the reward the emperor gave was also absurd. The Duke of Dambois. The hall was filled with cries of surprise and praise. Fan Xian stood there in a daze, wondering how he had suddenly been made a duke. Wasn't this even higher than the old man's? The emperor's stick was ruthless, but the size of the sweets he gave was also not small. He was only one step away from becoming a prince, an incomparably noble title. He tilted his head to glance at the awkward Zhongwei and wondered if he could casually beat him up in the future. Advertising to friends. http://mmchidian. commemweb 190516. ASPX, colored glass, beautiful demon. Thank you, everyone. If you want to know what happened next, please go to www.chidian.com. There are more chapters. Support the author. Support original reading. Chapter 468. Fan Xian's original title was a first-rank baron, second level, while a duke was superior. In between, there was still the rank of marquis. Given his present age, directly becoming a duke was truly a rare honor. Even he couldn't react for a moment. By the time the crowd reacted, they understood why. On one hand, the court wanted to reward him for his service in Jiangnan. On the other hand, everyone knew that the most important reason was that the emperor wanted to compensate his illegitimate son. The great prince and second prince had long been made princes. Fan Xian was only the Duke of Dambois. What did that count for? Thinking of this, the officials who had planned to stand out and fiercely oppose this reward all fell silent. This was a family matter of the royal family, not a national matter of the court. It was not their place to speak out. After Fan Xian's joy, he immediately calmed down. For most of the people in this hall, a duke was indeed a shiny golden word. For him, the power in his hands had long exceeded this boundary. Furthermore, the emperor had not given him a greeting and had the imperial censorate squeeze into the Overwatch Council's sphere of influence. This was the problem that Fan Xian truly cared about and feared. Thus, he would rather throw away his previous description and pester endlessly than let the emperor easily stuff sand in. Furthermore, he faintly knew that the position of duke was the final destination he could reach in the Qin kingdom. Presently, the Duke of Dambois was a third-level duke. There were still 2 more levels he could climb. After that, it looked like he would have to retire at such a young age. Thinking of this, he couldn't help but feel a bit perplexed and feel that it was absurd. He couldn't resist standing in the hall and laughing involuntarily. Everyone's attention was focused on the youngest duke since the founding of the Qin kingdom. Looking at his hateful smile, the emotions in their hearts were complicated. They felt that this laughter was incomparably ear-piercing. The court conference lasted until after lunch before it ended. This was because the official court discussions with the governors of the 3 roads had been delayed until later. The emperor cut the Gordian knot with a sharp knife. The emperor decided most of the matters alone and dismissed the officials. The officials had long been hungry. They all passed through the palace doors and returned to their manners. However, there were still some people who could not leave. The officials of the Hall of Governmental Affairs, the governors of the 3 roads who had not returned to the capital in a long time, and the various ministers carefully followed the emperor to the royal study. Fan Xian followed at the back with a helpless expression. Just like a year ago when he returned to the Qin kingdom from northern Qi, there was still a seat left for Fan Xian in the royal study. Last time, it was because of Zhuang Mohan's carriage of books. This time, it was because of the countless snowflakes silver the palace treasury had sent over. Fan Xian sat on the round embroidered stool, feeling a little uneasy. The voices in the royal study discussing national affairs did not interest him. Government affairs had never been his strong suit, and he could not come up with any ideas. In the end, he could only play the role of picking up what was missing and making up for what was lacking. It was clear that the emperor was aware of his abilities. He also did not want Fan Xian to express too many opinions on national affairs, so he did not mention his name today. However, he, the newly promoted duke, still had a place to sit. Beside the emperor's soft couch, the crown prince and the other princes still had to stand obediently and listen and learn like students. Fan Xian felt good. He thought he could be considered the teacher of his royal brothers. The emperor and various figures discussed the snow disaster in the south, the situation in the north, and the auspicious signs in the garden. Then, they began to put out the food. Fan Xian had been busy all night. The lamb slices and tofu pudding had long been digested. Hearing the food being put out, he couldn't help but feel his spirits rise. A sense of happiness rose in his heart, like a walk-on, finally having a box meal. Accepting the food box the eunuch handed over, he ate without speaking and swept away everything. The main matters had already been decided at the court conference. There was nothing new in the meeting in the royal study. It was just that when Xue Qing occasionally brought up the Hangzhou Conference's excellent performance in the disaster relief matter in Jiangnan, the ministers in Jingdou expressed a glimmer of surprise. They had heard of the Hangzhou Conference, but they had not thought that the Hangzhou Conference would have such great wealth and power to be able to do so many things outside of the government's disaster relief. The emperor had Fan Xian rise to explain. Listening to Fan Xian's explanation, only then did Xu Wu and the others understand that behind the Hangzhou Conference were the ladies in the royal palace. In name, the leader was the Empress Dowager. No wonder the Hangzhou Conference had such power. However, everyone knew that the palace was only using the name of caring for the people. The one who truly did things and paid the silver was probably still Fan Xian. The emperor smiled and said, "The one who has truly worked hard is not Fan Xian. It is my Qin girl." The officials chuckled and said a few words of flattery. They even loudly praised the nobles in the palace, especially the emperor. The emperor looked at Fan Xian's slightly absent-minded face and furrowed his brows slightly. The great prince watched this scene from the side and said, "The princess is returning to the capital today." The emperor made an O sound. When he looked at Fan Xian again, his gaze softened. He smiled but didn't say anything. He also didn't have Fan Xian return to the palace early. He only immediately ended the meeting in the royal study and asked Fan Xian, who wanted to return the most, to stay. The calming incense slowly floated in the royal study. Its color was not as milky as the white smoke. Its fragrance was very light. Only the emperor and Fan Xian were left in the royal study. Fan Xian felt slightly uncomfortable because he didn't know what the emperor was about to say. The emperor drank a mouthful of bird's nest and raised his head to glance at Fan Xian, indicating for him to want another mouthful. Fan Xian quickly shook his head. One cannot express one's will without tranquility. One cannot reach far. The emperor put down the bowl and slowly said, "Do not be troubled or worried. Do not lose one's way. This was the explanation you gave to everyone when you opened that bookstore in Jingdo 2 years ago." Fan Xian nodded. The name of the Dombo bookstore came from this. However, Ruo's sister knew his intentions and was different from others. She gave the explanation of drifting in Danzhou. Thinking of this, he suddenly missed that silly girl. He didn't know if she was having a good time in the north. "I like these 2 sentences of yours very much. You should know what it means for you to be the Duke of Dombo." The emperor calmly looked at his most accomplished illegitimate child. Fan Xian lowered his head and thought for a moment. He then said seriously, "Express one's will and worry less." "Correct," the emperor calmly said. "You need to know what you should do, but think less about what you can do." A pure official? A lone official? In reality, the meaning was very simple. As an official of the emperor, one should not be troubled or worried. Fan Xian didn't know what he was thinking. The smile on his face appeared very sincere and relaxed. He opened his mouth and said, "I understand." For a ruler and official to respond, the one who said he understood should be the emperor. However, Fan Xian had said it so clearly, yet it did not seem strange. The emperor also did not show any displeasure. Serving to the side, Eunuch Yao's face was calm. During these 2 years, he had grown used to the emperor's treatment of Fan Xian being different. The emperor waved his hand. Eunuch Yao bowed and left the royal study. After a moment of silence, the emperor coldly said, "As for the matter of the imperial censor entering the Overwatch Council, you will understand in the future. I know your heart is good. However, the matters of court cannot be changed by the hearts of people." Fan Xian knew that there were not many people here, so he couldn't make a scene or act spoiled or forcefully resist. He could only remain silent. The emperor then slowly said, "It's still the same words. I know your heart. That is why I'm very happy about what happened last night. However, I never thought you would be so forceful. It was a bit unexpected." Fan Xian's throat was a bit dry. After thinking for a moment, he replied solemnly, "The river has not burst its banks. I will first lead the water away to prevent the people from suffering." The emperor looked at Fan Xian's face and didn't say anything. After a long time, he nodded his head in relief. "However, have you thought about it? You have sucked out all the water, but there will be flowing water in the future. Who knows whether or not the water will once again overflow the banks. Thus, I thought that I would have to keep watching until the day the mountains collapse and the earth cave in. Only then would I know whether or not the water in the river will flow downstream or shamelessly break through my great banks. Child, you pretend to be fierce on the surface, but there is always a soft spot in your heart." The emperor's face became cold. He continued, "In my life, I only desire 2 things, the world and the inheritance. If I don't see their hearts clearly, how can I let go and conquer the world? Don't move anymore and watch with me." Fan Xian was silent and vigilant, not daring to reply. The emperor's first words were full of warning. The Duke of Dombo could forever only be a duke. Yet, he wanted him to keep watching with him and also wanted him to maintain his calm and not attack the second prince and crown prince's faction. This was another promise of a lifetime of glory and supreme trust. Also, don't waste time with Xiaoyi. The emperor stared into his eyes and said, "Xiaoyi has done a great service to the country and is a fierce general in the military. I don't want him to fall in these matters." Fan Xian froze slightly. He thought to himself that he and Governor Yin had formed an irreconcilable enmity. How could this be resolved? Besides, even if Yin Xiaoyi had done a great service to the country, his relationship with the eldest princess was too deep. Was the emperor not afraid at all? He finally confirmed that the person who had sent Eunuch Hong to break the situation last night was not the Empress Dowager, but the emperor himself. He grew increasingly confused. In the martial conference, what if the governor challenges me? He glanced at the emperor and asked worriedly. The Qing kingdom revered martial arts. If Yin Xiaoyi challenged Fan Xian in the palace, the emperor could not say something like that in front of all the officials that Fan Xian was a prince and could not be harmed. Yin Xiaoyi will leave before the martial conference, the emperor said. Fan Xian furrowed his brows and said, "But the governor put his son's death on my account." The emperor glanced at him with a not-quite-there smile and said, "Did you kill him?" Fan Xian replied sincerely, "This matter indeed has nothing to do with me. I wouldn't dare to secretly kill the son of an official." The emperor laughed loudly. What a good wouldn't dare to secretly kill. Were the killings last night open killings? Fan Xian's face reddened, and he said, "The ones who moved last night were all Jianghu people. It has nothing to do with the court." The emperor was silent for a moment, and then said, "The ones who moved in Yuantai camp were people from Dongyi, so I am curious as to whether or not there would be any problems over there. I want to see if Xiaoyi is a smart person." Fan Xian's expression was calm, but he was crying bitterly in his heart. 13th Wang, 13th Wang. You've even tricked the emperor. It was clear that the emperor had made an incorrect judgment because of this wrong source of information. Yet, Fan Xian could not, no matter what, warn him. As for Xiaoyi's problem, I must remind you that the military cannot fall into chaos. The emperor's gaze became deep and serene. He opened his mouth to sigh and said, "The Hu chieftains in the west are making trouble again." The Hu people in the west were making trouble? Fan Xian raised his head in shock and looked at the emperor's slightly worried face. For a moment, he was so shocked he didn't know what to say. 20 years ago, the emperor had led an army on an expedition to the west and had already killed the people of Shi Hu to the point of desolation. In addition, a few years ago, the great prince had led an army to sweep through the west. Why were the Hu people making trouble again? Furthermore, even if they did, given the strength of the Qing kingdom's military and the number of generals, the emperor would not be worried about the instability of military morale because of foreign aggression. Fan Xian had grown up in the Qing kingdom. He knew that when the Qing kingdom was first founded, it had been bullied and humiliated by Shi Hu for a number of years. The Hu people had always been a great threat to the Qing kingdom. It was only during these 20 years, under the powerful suppression of the Qing emperor, that they had become disdainful of becoming a topic of conversation among the Qing people. The emperor looked at Fan Xian's shocked expression and smiled mockingly. The Qing kingdom has suffered disasters year after year. Droughts and floods add to each other, and snowstorms arrive. Coincidentally, Shi Hu has had good weather these 2 years. The grass grows and the horses are fat. Of course, if that was all, the mere Hu barbarians would not make me so careful. However, did you know that before the Qing kingdom's snowstorm, the snowy barbarians to the north of northern Qi also suffered their biggest frost disaster in decades? Fan Xian furrowed his brows and suddenly thought of the matter Haitang Duo had once worriedly mentioned to him by the lake in Hangzhou half a year ago. Those northern barbarians had indeed suffered from a snowstorm. Countless cattle, sheep, and horses had frozen to death. However, the northern barbarians and Shi were very far apart. What did this have to do with the Qing kingdom? Who knew if the little emperor would have other thoughts? In the end, the emperor slowly said, "Xiaoyi will return to the north in a few days because the little emperor in the north has finally convinced the Empress Dowager to have Shang Shanhu rise again. The main camp is charging toward Yinjing." Shock flashed through Fan Xian's eyes, and he immediately restrained it. Outside the royal palace, in the black carriage, Fan Xian rubbed the space between his brows. He felt a bit uncomfortable. For one, he was too tired. For another, He had heard too much bad news in the palace. Just as the emperor had said, without a few years of rest, she who would not be able to pose a real threat to the Qin kingdom. However, in northern Qi, Shang Shanhu had returned. Shang Shanhu. Fan Xian's head hurt when he thought of this name. Although he had not seen the assassination on the long street that rainy night, he had always deeply understood the power of that famous general. Could Yin Xiaoyi go to the north to stop Shang Shanhu? Furthermore, Brother Xiaoyi had recently lost a son. He would probably gradually grow apart from the court. The emperor was not afraid that Yin Xiaoyi would go crazy and join the enemy. As for why Fan Xian was so wary of Shang Shanhu's return, the reason was actually very simple. In Shangjing, he had ruthlessly schemed against Shang Shanhu and caused countless of his subordinates to die wretchedly. In the middle of the night, a cry of Fan Xian, the one who killed me, was probably still echoing in northern Qi Shangjing. Furthermore, Shang Shanhu's adoptive father, Sir Shaoan, had been captured and killed by him again and again. In this matter, Fan Xian was Shang Shanhu's greatest enemy. Xinzhong was only a minor character. For the sake of revenge, Shang Shanhu had killed Xinzhong with a spear in that rainy night. If they actually met on the battlefield in the future, how would Shang Shanhu deal with him? Fan Xian thought sorrowfully in the carriage. There were so many enemies in this world. I just couldn't find a way to add quality to the replies in the new book review section. Whoosh. Everyone, forgive my stupidity. Tomorrow is Monday. Everyone has to work and go to school again. I wish you peace. To be continued. If you want to know what happens next, please log on to www.chidian.com. There are more chapters. Support the author. Support the original reading. You're tuning in to the Romance Rendezvous YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.